She was worth $3 billion. She could have bought any house on earth. So why did she choose the one next door to a broke mechanic in Savannah, Georgia? And why had she been watching him for over a year before he ever knew her name? When the truth finally came out, it didn't arrive gently. It arrived the way most painful things do, through someone who wanted to burn everything down. And standing in his garage, grease on his hands and betrayal in his chest, Ethan Cross had to decide whether the past year of his life had been real, or the most elaborate lie anyone had ever told him. This is their story. Stay until the end. Hit like, drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The Mustang had been sitting in Ethan Cross's garage for 11 days before he touched it. That wasn't like him. Normally, the moment a car came through those two rolling bay doors, he was already mentally tearing it apart, seeing what she used to be underneath all the rust and neglect, mapping out the path back. Cars talked to him that way. Always had. People were a different story, but this one sat there under a tarp, and Ethan kept finding reasons to work on other things. The '68 Camaro in the second bay, the billing he'd been ignoring, the fence post out back that had been leaning since the last storm in March. His daughter called him out on it Thursday morning. "Daddy, you haven't uncovered the Mustang yet." Lily was 9 years old, missing her two front teeth and constitutionally incapable of minding her own business. She sat on the old wooden stool near the tool bench, the one he'd padded with an old seat cushion so she'd stop complaining the metal was cold, and watched him with those dark eyes that saw everything. "I've been busy," he said. "You filed your invoices twice yesterday. You don't file invoices twice." Ethan looked at her over his shoulder. "You were watching me file invoices? There's nothing else to do here." She picked up a socket wrench she had no business touching. He took it from her without a word. "What's wrong with the Mustang?" "Nothing's wrong with the Mustang." "Then why won't you look at it?" He didn't answer her. Not because he didn't know. He did know, and that was the problem. The '69 Mustang Mach 1 under that tarp had belonged to Daniel Reeves, a retired schoolteacher who'd passed away in February. His daughter had called Ethan in March, voice raw and uncertain, asking if he could restore it. Daniel had always wanted to see it done. Never got around to it. Ethan had said yes immediately. He always said yes to those jobs. But every time he walked past the tarp, he thought about his own father's old truck. Still sitting at his mother's house in Pooler, registration expired, tires flat, covered in pine needles. And he thought about the fact that he hadn't been out there in 4 months. "Go get your backpack," he told Lily. "Bus in 20 minutes. She slid off the stool with a dramatic sigh that she'd clearly been practicing. "You should talk to someone, Daddy." "I talk to people." "You talk to cars." She disappeared into the house, and Ethan stood alone in the quiet of the garage, the May heat already building outside the open bay doors, the smell of motor oil and old metal around him like a second skin. He walked to the Mustang, put his hand on the edge of the tarp. Didn't pull it off. Tomorrow, he told himself, which was a lie he'd been telling himself for 11 days. The neighborhood Ethan lived in wasn't fancy by any stretch. Older houses, most of them. Big oak trees that dropped leaves and acorns constantly. Streets that flooded when it rained hard. His property sat at the end of a long gravel driveway with the house in front and the garage behind, separated from the neighboring lot by a wood fence that needed repainting about 3 years ago. The house next door had been empty since winter. Old Mr. and Mrs. Harlan had lived there for 30-something years. When Mrs. Harlan passed in November and her husband went to live with his son in Charleston, the property went quiet. Ethan had noticed the way you notice silence when something used to make noise. He'd look over sometimes from the garage and see the dark windows and the grass growing too long, and it felt like another thing gently falling apart. He wasn't prepared for what showed up on a Friday afternoon in late May. He heard it before he saw it. Not the woman, but the trucks. 2 large moving vans, plus a smaller cargo truck, plus a black SUV with tinted windows that parked on the street with a kind of authority that Ethan generally associated with people who expected to be waited on. He walked to the edge of his driveway and watched 3 men in matching shirts begin unloading furniture with the careful coordination of people who did this for a living. Good furniture. That was the first thing he registered. Not just decent furniture. The kind of pieces that were clearly chosen individually, not bought as a set. A worn leather armchair, a drafting table with a slanted top, a lamp that looked like it cost more than his truck. The second thing he registered was her. She came around the side of the SUV carrying a cardboard box and wearing clothes that didn't match the trucks or the furniture at all. Faded jeans, worn at the knees. A plain gray t-shirt, hair pulled back in a bun that was winning absolutely no awards. No jewelry that he could see. No assistant trailing behind her with a phone and a schedule. She was maybe 5'6", early 30s, and she moved like someone who was used to doing things herself, even when they could afford not to. She looked up from the box and caught him staring. Ethan raised a hand. Neighbor wave. Non-committal. She raised one back, held his gaze for a second longer than a stranger usually would, then walked inside. Huh, he thought, and went back to the Camaro. Her name came from Lily, because of course it did. The lady next door is named Victoria, Lily announced at dinner on Sunday, stabbing a piece of broccoli with conviction. She has a lot of books. She let me look at them through the window. You were looking through her window? The door was open. I knocked. She said hi. Lily shrugged like this was perfectly ordinary. She seems nice. She makes her coffee in one of those pour-over things. It takes forever. She said it's worth it. Ethan looked at his daughter across the kitchen table. When exactly did this happen? This afternoon when you were under the Camaro. She pointed her fork at him. You always say I can play in the backyard. I didn't say you could knock on the neighbor's door. She has a drafting table, Lily said, like this was decisive information that settled the matter. She draws stuff, buildings and bridges. She showed me one. Lily, her last name is Ashford. She moved here from New York. A pause. She doesn't seem like a New York person, though. Ethan had absolutely no idea how his 9-year-old had developed strong opinions about what New York people seemed like, but he let it go. She's probably just here for work, might not stay long. Lily made the face that meant she disagreed, but was choosing not to argue, which she'd recently discovered was more effective than arguing. She'd gotten that from her mother, which was not something Ethan enjoyed acknowledging. She asked about you, Lily said, casual. She asked about your daddy? She asked who owned the garage. I said you. Another bite. She said, oh, does he do restorations? Just like that. Like she already knew what kind of garage it was. Ethan put his fork down. What did you tell her? I said, yeah. You specialize in American classics from the 1960s and 70s. You're particularly good with fuel systems and bodywork, and you won a regional restoration award in 2021. She said it completely straight-faced, like she was reciting a memorized paragraph. Which she was. He'd made her memorize it for a school career day. He stared at her. What? It's true. She ate her broccoli. She seemed impressed. He officially met Victoria Ashford the following Tuesday. He was in the driveway loading supplies into the back of his truck when he heard the side gate, and she came around the fence carrying 2 coffee mugs. She moved with the same unhurried certainty he'd noticed on moving day, and she didn't apologize for showing up unannounced, which he found he didn't mind. I figured if I rang the doorbell you'd be working, she said, holding out one of the mugs. I made extra. Ethan wiped his hands on the rag hanging from his pocket and took the mug. It smelled extraordinary. Your pour-over thing? She smiled just slightly. Your daughter mentioned I converted her. She's 9. She doesn't drink coffee. I gave her the cup to smell. She's very enthusiastic. The smile settled into something easier, less performed. I'm Victoria. I moved in next door. I know, Ethan. He tasted the coffee. It was genuinely the best cup he'd had in a while, which he wasn't going to say out loud because it felt like losing something. You're an architect? Engineer, technically. Infrastructure, mostly. Bridges, water systems. She glanced at the garage. You're working on a Camaro? Client car. Also got a Mustang Mach-1 waiting that I haven't started yet. Something crossed her face, quick, there and gone. Interest, maybe? Or recognition of something. He couldn't read it clearly. Can I see? He hesitated, which wasn't something he usually did with clients or neighbors or anyone who showed curiosity about the work. The garage was open, visible from the road. People asked all the time. But something about the straightforwardness of her question caught him slightly off guard. Sure, he said. She followed him into the garage and didn't say anything for a long moment. She walked a slow circle around the Camaro in the first bay, crouching slightly to look at the door gaps, tilting her head to check the panel alignment. She wasn't performing interest. She was actually looking. The paint's new, but the gaps are off on the driver's door, she said. About 2 millimeters? Ethan stopped. 3. Client didn't mention the car had been in a wreck before he bought it. Frame slightly bent. Can you fix it without replacing the frame? I can get it closer. Not perfect. She nodded, accepting that, and moved toward the second bay where the tarp covered the Mustang. She looked at the tarp, looked at him. Is this one not for looking? There was no judgment in it, just a question. I'll get to it, Ethan said, which wasn't an answer. She didn't push. She took a slow sip of her own coffee and turned back toward the Camaro like the covered Mustang simply ceased to exist. What year? 68. Numbers matching, mostly. What does that mean? And that was how the conversation went. Her asking genuine questions, him answering, both of them drifting slowly from the car to the tools to the work itself. She knew enough to ask good questions. She didn't know enough to pretend she understood answers she didn't. It was a combination Ethan found deeply rare. 40 minutes later, he realized he'd been standing in the garage talking instead of loading his truck, which meant his supply run was going to make him late picking up Lily from school. I have to go, he said. I know, I'm sorry I kept you. She handed him back the mug. This was nice, though. It was. That was the honest answer. Yeah, he said. It was. The thing about Victoria Ashford was that she didn't try too hard. That was what Ethan kept coming back to in the weeks that followed, as she settled into the house next door with a quiet efficiency that reminded him, strangely, of the way he organized a job. She didn't make a project out of the neighborhood. She didn't throw a housewarming party or introduce herself to everyone on the block at once. She put out a bird feeder. She had a small garden started in the side yard within 2 weeks. She sat on her porch in the evenings with a sketchbook and drew things Ethan never got close enough to see clearly. She brought coffee sometimes. She borrowed tools. A level, a particular type of drill bit, a rubber mallet she needed for some shelving project that she handled herself rather than calling someone. She always brought things back the same day. She never asked for more than what she needed. In Ethan's experience, that was the rarest quality a person could have. He didn't know about the money. Not at first. He knew she worked from home, which didn't seem unusual. He knew she was in engineering. He knew she traveled occasionally and came back looking slightly tired, but never said much about where she'd been. She drove a reasonably nice but not extravagant SUV. She dressed simply. She didn't flash anything. It was Darren, Ethan's part-time helper who came in Tuesdays and Thursdays, who figured it out. Your neighbor, Darren said one Thursday in June, not looking up from the brake drum he was cleaning. Victoria Ashford. What about her? You know who that is, right? Ethan looked up from the Mustang, which he had finally pulled the tarp off of. Under the cover it was both worse and more promising than he'd expected, the way those things usually went. Original grabber orange paint underneath the faded maroon someone had sprayed over it badly in the 1980s. Solid bones under decades of neglect. She's an engineer. Darren set down the brake drum and looked at Ethan with the particular expression of a man who cannot believe what he's hearing. She's the Ashford of Ashford Infrastructure Group. They built the Millerton Bay Bridge in California, the water reclamation project in Phoenix. She sold her first company when she was 24 for like $100-something million and built a second one from scratch. He paused. She is worth approximately $3 billion, Ethan. Ethan held the orbital sander he'd been about to turn on and just held it. $3 billion. With a B. He looked out the open garage doors toward the fence line. The bird feeder was just visible. A cardinal was eating from it. She borrowed my rubber mallet, he said. I know. She brought it back the same day. I believe you. Ethan set the sander down. She never said anything. Why would she? Darren shrugged, picking the brake drum back up. Would you lead with that? Ethan thought about it. No. Right. A pause. Also, she's been on like 3 magazine covers, so I don't know how you missed it. I don't read magazines. Nobody reads magazines, Ethan. They're on the internet, too. See? Darren. Yeah. I'm going to sand this quarter panel now. Okay? He turned on the orbital sander and didn't think about it. He thought about it all afternoon. He didn't bring it up with her directly. That felt wrong. Calling out the gap between what she'd told him and what he'd found out felt like an accusation. And what exactly was she supposed to have said? Hi, I'm your new neighbor. I have $3 billion. Please treat me normally. She was a person living next door. She hadn't lied. She'd just been quiet. But he paid attention differently after that, more carefully. Less like a neighbor watching a neighbor, and more like a mechanic assessing a car he'd been too quick to dismiss. What he noticed was this. She was working. Actually working. Not the kind of work people did when they wanted to look busy. She kept unusual hours, was sometimes on the porch at 6 in the morning with a laptop, and sometimes visible through her kitchen window at 11 at night, looking at something Ethan assumed were plans. When she traveled, she came back with the slightly gray look of someone who'd spent 14 hours in airport terminals. She didn't talk about her work in detail, but she talked about it. Problems she was trying to solve, systems she was thinking through, the way water moved through infrastructure in a way that most people never considered. She talked about it the way he talked about cars. He started to understand what Lily had meant when she said Victoria didn't seem like a New York person. She didn't seem like a billionaire person, whatever that meant exactly. She seemed like someone who happened to have built something very large and then continued doing the work regardless. The evening he finally understood the full shape of her. They were sitting on his porch in the heat of a late June night, both of them with glasses of sweet tea, and she asked him about the Mustang. How's it going? Slowly, he admitted. Found the original color under the respray, grabber orange. He paused. That's the color it was in 1969. Factory original. Is that good or bad? Good for value. Means the car was never in a major accident before the respray. Whoever painted over it just... He stopped, searching for a way to explain it. Just decided they didn't want it to be what it was. Victoria turned her glass in her hands, looking out at the yard. The fireflies were starting up along the fence line. People do that too, she said. Yeah, he agreed. They do. A long quiet. The kind that didn't need filling. What happened to the owner? She asked. Ethan had to take a breath before he answered. Retired teacher, bought the car when he was 22. Always meant to restore it, but life got in the way. He passed in February. He looked at the garage. His daughter asked me to finish it. That's a good thing to be trusted with. It is. A beat. I pulled the tarp off 2 weeks ago. I saw. She didn't explain how she'd seen. She just had. You'll do right by it, she said. Not as encouragement, exactly. More as a statement of observed fact. Ethan looked at her. She was watching the fireflies with the focused attention she gave most things, like they were worth the effort of actually seeing. How do you know? He said. Not argumentative, genuinely curious. She thought about it. Because you covered it up instead of just never starting. That means you care too much. People who don't care don't bother being careful. A small pause. You're just giving yourself time to be equal to it. He didn't say anything for a moment. That's a strange thing to know about someone you met 2 months ago. She looked at him then. Something briefly unreadable in her expression. Careful. Aware of some line she was standing close to. I pay attention, she said simply. He nodded, like that was enough. And for that moment, it was. What he didn't know, what he couldn't know, was how much attention and for how long. July in Savannah was the kind of heat that had weight to it. You didn't walk through it so much as wade. The garage got brutal by midday, and Ethan had learned over the years to start early and take a long break through the afternoon before coming back in the evening when the air became something that could theoretically be breathed again. Victoria adapted to the schedule without being asked. She'd appear in the morning with coffee while he was pulling covers and running early diagnostics, and then she'd be gone through the midday. And sometimes she'd come back in the early evening with 2 sandwiches from the place on Broughton Street and sit on the old stool Lily had claimed and sketch while he worked. She sketched constantly. Pad and pencil, always pencil, filling pages with things that were sometimes clearly structures, bridge towers, load-bearing arches, the way stress distributed through a system, and sometimes just objects, his tools, the garage interior. Once, working while he was under the Mustang, she'd drawn the car from the front quarter, and when he'd seen it on her pad later, she'd handed it over without making a thing of it. He still had it, though he hadn't mentioned that to anyone. Their conversations covered ground in a way Ethan didn't entirely track until he looked back later. They talked about Lily, her school, the phase she was going through of wanting to learn everything about birds, the complicated reality of raising a kid alone. They talked about Victoria's projects, the ones she could describe without proprietary complications. They talked about the neighborhood, the history of the house next door, the way Savannah had changed and hadn't changed. They talked around certain things, too. She didn't ask about his marriage or his ex-wife, and he didn't ask about her personal life beyond what she offered. She offered very little, and he didn't push, because he understood the value of spaces in a conversation. What he didn't know was that there were things she wanted to say and couldn't find the opening for. Things that sat behind her measured answers like pressure behind a sealed door. The night of the storm was the first time Ethan saw her rattled. August. A tropical system that had been wandering up the coast for days finally made its mind up and came inland hard, and Savannah got the kind of rain that reminded everyone in the Low Country that the city existed largely at the mercy of water. Ethan had spent the afternoon getting the garage secured, moving both project cars back from the bay doors, checking the drainage situation. Around 9 p.m., power went out. He was in the kitchen with flashlights and candles, Lily already asleep upstairs, having declared the whole situation cozy, when he heard it. A sharp cracking sound from next door, followed by what could only be described as a significant structural complaint. He grabbed a flashlight and went out. The large oak in Victoria's backyard had partially split in the wind, and one major limb had come down across her back porch, which had in turn partially collapsed onto a storage unit she'd built against the back of the house. She was standing in the rain in a raincoat that was doing approximately nothing, flashlight in one hand, phone in the other, looking at the damage with an expression Ethan hadn't seen on her before. She looked lost. Not panicked, not helpless. Just like someone standing in a room where everything had shifted and they were trying to recalibrate. Victoria. She turned. In the wet beam of his flashlight, her face was rain-soaked and tight with something she was clearly working to contain. The oak came down. I heard it. You okay? I'm fine. Automatic. She looked back at the damage. I don't... She stopped. I've handled bigger infrastructure failures than this, she said, mostly to herself. This is just a tree. It's more than a tree. Your porch is compromised. He moved closer to look at the damage. You're not going to get anyone out here tonight in this rain. You have a guest room. I'm not... She started to argue. I'm not asking you to move in, he said. I'm asking whether you can sleep somewhere that's not under a partially collapsed porch, in case the rest of it decides to follow. A long pause. Rain hammering everything. The limb groaned. Yes, she said. I have a guest room. Then go sleep in it. I'll come back in the morning and we'll assess. She looked at him with that unreadable expression again, the one that had something careful underneath it. Why would you do that? The question surprised him. Because you're my neighbor and a tree fell on your house. That's just what people do. She looked down. Something shifted in her face that he didn't have a name for. Okay, she said quietly. He was back at 6 in the morning with Chainsaw, Ladder, and Darren, who had shown up because Ethan had called him, and Darren was the kind of person who came when called. By noon, they had the limb sectioned and moved, the porch assessed, the structure was sound, the decking needed replacement, and a temporary weatherproofing situation sorted that would hold until she could get a contractor. Victoria made enough coffee for all three of them and didn't hover. She handled the insurance call herself without asking him to stay. When Darren left, she handed Ethan a check, and he handed it back. For supplies, she insisted. The supplies were $40. Keep it. Ethan. Victoria. He looked at her steadily. I didn't help you because I needed the $40. She held the check for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her pocket. I don't know how to do this gracefully, she admitted, and he understood she wasn't talking about the check. "Nobody does," he said. That's not actually how it works." Late August. The Mustang's engine was out and on the stand, and Ethan had spent 3 weeks rebuilding the 428 Cobra jet, a process that required the kind of patient, methodical focus that was either meditative or maddening, depending on your disposition. His was generally meditative, but this block had surprises. There were always surprises. He was working late on a Wednesday, Lily asleep in the house, the garage open to catch whatever air was moving, when his phone buzzed. Nicole. He stared at the name on the screen for long enough that the call went to voicemail. Then she called again. He answered the second time because not answering felt like a choice he'd have to explain to himself. "Ethan." Her voice was the same. He'd expected it to feel strange, hearing it. It just felt familiar, which was somehow worse. "Nicole, I heard you're working on a Mach 1. Someone was talking about it at the dealership." The dealership. She was still at the Chevy dealership on the edge of town then. He'd wondered. "Word gets around. I also heard it might be a significant restoration. Numbers matching, original color under the respray." He kept his voice level. "Where'd you hear that?" "Around." A pause that carried deliberate weight. "Those go for a lot of money, Ethan, properly done. You could be looking at 6 figures. I know what they go for. I just thought..." "Nicole." He closed his eyes briefly. "It's almost 10 o'clock. I know what time it is." Something shifted in her voice, harder. "We were married for 6 years. I'm entitled to..." "We were divorced 2 years ago. You signed papers." "About the house and Lily, not about future earnings from..." "Good night, Nicole." He ended the call and stood in the garage listening to the crickets and the distant sound of the interstate. Then he set the phone face down on the workbench and went back to the engine. An hour later, he heard footsteps on the gravel and turned to find Victoria in the garage doorway. She'd clearly been working late herself. She was in reading glasses she usually wore only at home, and she held her sketchbook like she'd carried it outside without thinking about it. "I saw the light," she said. "Is everything okay?" He thought about saying yes automatically. Thought about the standard issue fine, just working late, no problem answer he gave everyone. Instead he said, "My ex-wife called. She's interested in the Mustang project." Victoria came further into the garage. She didn't ask questions. She sat on the stool and waited. "We were married for 6 years, he said, starting back in on the engine not because the engine needed him to, but because his hands needed something to do. It ended badly, not violently or anything like that, just badly. The slow kind, where you've been 2 separate people for so long that the marriage is the last thing to figure it out." He didn't look at her. "Lily was 4 when we separated." A long silence. Victoria took off the reading glasses and turned them in her hands. "She wants money from the restoration project?" "She hasn't said that exactly, but that's where it's going." He paused. "I gave her everything that was fair in the divorce, everything the lawyers said, and then some because I wanted it to be done. And she took it, and she still..." He stopped. "Still comes back," Victoria said quietly. "Still comes back." He finished the sentence he was working on with the torque wrench before he looked up at her. She was watching him with that steady, careful attention she brought to problems she was working to understand. Not pity. Something more precise than pity. "She's going to make this complicated," he said. "I can feel it." "Probably," Victoria agreed. "That doesn't bother you to say? Would you prefer I tell you it'll be fine?" He looked at her. "No." "Then I won't." She stood, tucking the sketchbook under her arm. "For what it's worth, so the car is yours. The work is yours. Whatever she thinks she has a claim to, she'll have to prove in a room where you have lawyers, too. I've got a kid to raise and a mortgage." "I know." She said it like it didn't change the math, like his having limited resources wasn't a reason the outcome would go wrong. "Ethan." She waited until he looked at her directly. "You do good work. That has a value that doesn't belong to anyone but you." She left the way she always came, quietly, without making a ceremony of it. He stood in the garage after she was gone, hand resting on the engine block. The Mustang engine smelled like oil and old metal and possibility. He thought, she talks to me like I'm not a problem to be solved. He thought, nobody has done that in a long time. He thought, I need to be careful here. He went back to work. September brought the hint of something easier in the air. A degree or two off the worst of the summer, the evening starting to carry a different quality of light. Ethan had the Mustang's engine rebuilt and back in the car, and the body was down to bare metal, and he'd sourced the correct grabber orange paint through a supplier in Atlanta who'd done some calling around for him. The restoration was starting to show its shape. That was the moment in a project he lived for, when the thing a car used to be started to become visible through all the years and damage on top of it. He was in that frame of mind the evening that Victoria came over the fence with 2 beers and a question she clearly wasn't sure how to ask. I need your advice, she said, handing him a bottle and sitting on the overturned milk crate he kept near the bay door for exactly this purpose. Professional, sort of. He took the beer. Okay. I'm looking at an older property for a project. The building has some... She paused, choosing words. It has some history. The previous owners didn't always take care of it. There's structural damage that's been hidden under newer surfaces. She looked at him. Is that a reason not to take it on? Or is that just the work? Ethan drank his beer. What conditions the foundation? Good, actually. Solid. Then that's most of it. Everything above the foundation can be addressed. He watched her. You're not actually asking about a building. She was quiet for a moment. No, she admitted. I'm not. He waited. I have... She stopped and started again. There's something I want, and I have been patient about wanting it. I have been patient in a way that I'm not generally known for, and I'm starting to wonder whether my patience has been... She turned the bottle in her hands, misread or unnoticed, or whether I've been patient in a way that just looks like I don't want anything. Ethan kept his eyes on the yard. The fireflies were back. They were always back. What do you want? He asked. A very long pause. I want someone to know me, she said. Not... She made a small, frustrated gesture. Not my work, not what I've built. People think if they know what I've accomplished, they know me. They don't. They know... She stopped. A resume isn't a person. No, he agreed. You know that already. I can tell you know that. She looked at him directly then. You don't treat me like an achievement. You talk to me like I'm a person. Do you know how... She caught herself. Recalibrated. That's not something I take for granted. He looked at her. In the fading evening light, she looked like herself. Not a billionaire, not an entrepreneur, not anything on a magazine cover, just a person who was being careful with something that mattered to her. The building, he said slowly, the one with the solid foundation and damage above the waterline. Yes. Take it on, he said. If the foundation's good, the rest is just work. And the history doesn't make it less worth having, usually makes it more. Victoria looked at him for a moment. Something shifted in her face. Relief, maybe, or the release of something held tightly. Okay, she said softly. Okay, he agreed. They sat there in the settling dark and finished their beers. What he didn't yet know, what was still 20 feet away behind the wall of everything she hadn't yet told him, was that her patience had roots longer than 2 months of borrowed tools and evening conversations. That the thing she wanted had a specific shape, that its shape looked exactly like him, and that she had been waiting for the right time to tell him, and the right time kept not arriving, and the clock was quietly running out. October. The Mustang was 2 weeks from done. Ethan could see the finish line now. The grabber orange had gone on beautifully, and the chrome was all sourced and polished, and the interior was being reupholstered by a woman in Augusta who was the best he'd ever worked with. The 428 Cobra Jet sounded the way it was supposed to sound, which was like a contained natural disaster, and he'd test-driven it 3 times to confirm the rebuilt suspension was tracking right. He was going to call Daniel Reeves's daughter this week to update her on the timeline. He was not going to think about what number the car might sell for, because Nicole had called twice more in September and once already in October, and the calls had gotten longer and her hints had gotten less veiled, and Ethan's patience for it was eroding in the way that all patience eventually did when nothing changed. The morning everything broke open started like any other. Victoria was at her kitchen table with her laptop and a new sketchbook she'd started last week. Lily was at school. Ethan was doing paperwork at the house before going to the garage, and the knock on his front door came just before 9. He should have known from the knock. Nicole always knocked that way. 3 sharp raps. Not quite rude, but not patient either. He opened the door. She was dressed the way she always dressed for things she considered business. Good blazer. Something that said, "I am to be taken seriously," without quite becoming a suit. Her dark hair was shorter than he remembered. She looked tired in a way she was trying to compensate for. "Ethan," she said. "Nicole." He didn't move from the doorway. "You didn't say you were coming." "I was in the area." A lie, probably. She didn't live in the area. "I thought we should talk in person." "About what?" Her gaze moved past him into the house, and he recognized the inventory she was doing. Cataloging. Assessing. An old habit. "About the Mustang. Can I come in?" "We can talk here." Something hardened briefly in her expression before she smoothed it over. "Ethan, we have a daughter together. We can be adults about this." "We are being adults about this." "I'm standing in the door having a conversation like an adult. What do you want, Nicole?" She took a breath. When she spoke again, it was with a precision that told him she'd rehearsed it. "When we divorced, certain assets weren't fully accounted for. Specifically, future earnings from restoration work that was in progress or planned during the lawyers covered all of this. Not restoration work begun after. The Mustang wasn't begun during our marriage. It wasn't begun after our marriage. It's a job I took 8 months ago, Nicole. But I'm going to stop you right there." He kept his voice level through genuine effort. "You don't have a claim to this. You know you don't have a claim to this. You're going to find that out when you talk to whoever is advising you, because if a lawyer is telling you otherwise, they're taking your money." She stared at him. The calculation behind her eyes was visible, and he thought, there was a time when I didn't see that, and I don't know if I was blind or if it wasn't there yet. "You're seeing someone," she said, a hard pivot. "The woman next door." He went still. "Excuse me?" "I asked around. Victoria Ashford. She moved in next door to you in May." Her chin lifted slightly. "You two seem close." "She's my neighbor." "Ethan." The word carried the weight of someone who believed they had information. "I know she's more than your neighbor, and I know some things about Victoria Ashford that you probably don't." Something shifted in his gut. Not fear. Something more like the feeling of seeing a car that's been in a wreck before you check the Carfax. The slight wrongness that precedes confirmation. "What things?" he said. Nicole looked at him with an expression that was half triumph and half genuine uncertainty, like someone who'd found a weapon and wasn't entirely sure they wanted to use it. "Ask her how long she's known about you," she said. "Ask her why she specifically chose the house next door. Ask her what she knew before she introduced herself." Then she turned and walked back to her car. Ethan stood in the open doorway. The morning was bright and ordinary, and he heard, from somewhere behind him, the neighbor's gate open and close. He did not turn around. He stood in the doorway for a long time after Nicole's car pulled away. The morning was doing what October mornings in Savannah did, burning off the early chill slowly, the light coming in low and gold through the oak trees. Somewhere down the street, a dog barking at something it would never catch. Ordinary sounds. The kind of sounds that keep happening regardless of what's falling apart around them. Ethan closed the front door. He didn't go to the garage. He sat down at the kitchen table where he'd been doing paperwork 20 minutes ago, and he looked at the stacks of invoices and parts receipts and client forms without seeing any of them. His coffee had gone cold. He didn't notice. "Ask her how long she's known about you." Nicole had a talent for that. Saying the thing that landed exactly right. Not the thing that would definitely destroy you, but the thing that would make you unsure. The thing that required checking. She'd always been better at uncertainty than at direct attack, because direct attacks could be defended against, and uncertainty just sat there in your chest doing quiet damage. He thought about Victoria on his porch in September, saying, "I pay attention." He thought about the first time she'd come to the garage with coffee and asked about the Camaro in a way that suggested she already knew what kind of car it was. He thought about the particular quality of her interest in him, present from the start, never forced, never too much. The way she knew how he took his coffee before he'd told her, the way she'd been unsurprised by anything about him, ever, in the entire 5 months he'd known her. The way the best liars were always unsurprised, because they'd already run the scenarios. He stopped that thought, held it up and looked at it and tried to be fair. He didn't know anything yet. He had Nicole's word, which had a well-documented reliability problem. But the uncertainty was already in his chest. He could feel it doing its work. He picked up his coffee, remembered it was cold, set it back down. Then he got up, went to the garage, and pulled the roller door closed behind him. Not because he was going to work, because the garage was the only place where the thinking was ever any good. The Mustang stood under the bright overhead light in its new grabber orange paint, chrome gleaming on every surface that was supposed to gleam. She was almost finished. She was almost everything Daniel Reeves had wanted her to be. Standing here should have felt like something closing toward completion. Instead, Ethan put his back against the wall next to the tool chest and looked at the car and thought about the thing that had always been true about restoration work. You could never fully know a car's history until you got beneath the surface it was showing you. You could run a Carfax and do a visual inspection and still not know what was really there until you got the panels off. The question was whether you trusted what you'd found underneath once you did. He was still standing there when his phone buzzed. "Darren, coming in today or not?" The Camaro client called. He typed back, "Give me an hour." He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the Mustang for another minute. Then he pulled the door up and went next door. The gate between their properties was open. It was usually open now. Neither of them had ever discussed it. It had just drifted that way over the months, both of them going in and out without ceremony. He noticed that now in a way he hadn't before. When had that happened exactly? Who had started it? He knocked on her back door. Victoria answered, still holding her coffee mug, reading glasses pushed up on her head, in the kind of clothes that said she'd been at her desk since early. She read his face immediately. He knew she could. She'd always been good at that. And something shifted in her expression, carefully. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He didn't come in. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes?" She stepped back from the door. "Come in." "I'm okay here." He watched her process that, the not coming in, the distance he was keeping. She processed it without letting her face do too much. "How did you know about the garage when you moved in?" A very slight pause. Not long enough to be obviously evasive, long enough that he noticed it. "What do you mean?" "The first time you came over, you asked if I did restorations. You didn't ask what I did in the garage. You knew it was restoration specifically. American classics, you said." He kept his voice level. "Lily told me later that when she introduced herself, you already knew." Victoria set her coffee mug on the counter behind her. She was buying half a second, and he could see her deciding something. "I looked you up," she said, "before I introduced myself. Your garage has a website." "My garage has a website," he agreed. "It also doesn't have my home address on it. It has a business address, which is a P.O. box in Midtown." He watched her. "So how did you know where I lived?" The pause this time was longer. She looked at him with something that was working to stay composed and not entirely succeeding. "Ethan, Nicole came by this morning." He said it straight. No build-up, no softening. "She said I should ask you how long you've known about me. She said I should ask why you chose the house next door specifically." The color changed in Victoria's face, not draining away exactly. More like the light behind her expression shifted, something becoming exposed that had been carefully kept back. "What exactly did she tell you?" Victoria said. Her voice was quieter than usual. "Not much. Enough to make me come over here." He crossed his arms, not aggressively, just because he needed to do something with them. "So I'm asking, did you know who I was before you moved in?" She held his gaze for 5 full seconds. "Yes," she said. The word landed in the space between them and stayed there. He'd expected it, and it still hit him somewhere in the sternum. He took a breath through his nose, kept his face still. "How long?" "A little over a year before I moved here." The morning birds were going outside. A truck went past on the street. Somewhere in the house, something electronic made a small sound. A year, he said. Yes. You'd known about me for a year, and then you moved in next door. Yes. He uncrossed his arms because they felt too rigid. He put his hands in his pockets instead. I need you to tell me the rest of it. She nodded. She picked up her coffee, then put it back down again without drinking it. Not out here, she said. Come inside. Victoria, but please. Not dramatic, just asking. I'll tell you everything. She stopped. I'd rather not do it in the doorway. He came inside. The kitchen was the room he'd been in most over the months. It was where she made coffee and where they'd had most of the impromptu conversations that turned into hour-long conversations without either of them planning it. He knew the room, its details, the particular afternoon light it got through the east window. He sat down at the kitchen table and waited. She stayed standing for a moment, then pulled out the chair across from him and sat. She put both hands flat on the table. It struck him as an unusual gesture for her. She was generally contained in her physical presence, economical, and he understood it as her trying to be open in whatever way she could manage. There was a parts store, she said, in Pooler, about 14 months ago. I was in town for a meeting. I had a project consultation down here, and my GPS routed me past it, and I needed to stop because I had a rental car and something was rattling, and I thought it might be loose. She looked at the table. You were inside. You were talking to the guy behind the counter about a specific carburetor for a 1966 Chevelle. You knew exactly what you needed, exactly why the generic replacement wasn't going to work, and you spent 20 minutes explaining the difference with... She paused. You had this patience about it, like the information mattered, and you wanted to get it right, not for the other guy necessarily, just because it should be right. Ethan sat very still. I was there for maybe 10 minutes, she continued. I asked about my rattle. It was nothing, a loose panel. I left. She looked up. I thought about you for 3 days after that. Not in a... She made a small, frustrated gesture. Not the way that sounds. I just couldn't stop thinking about someone who cared that much about getting something right when nobody was watching. You didn't talk to me, he said. No. You left. Yes. A beat. I'd been in meetings for 2 days straight about a bridge project that was going over budget because everyone involved cared more about the politics of the budget than about the bridge. And then I walked into a random parts store and saw someone who just... She stopped. It struck me. That's all. It struck me, and I left, and I went back to New York, and I thought I'd forget about it. But you didn't. No. She said it simply, without apology. I found your garage online. You were right. The address wasn't listed. But there were photos of your work on the site, and there was a community article from a Savannah paper about the restoration award you won, and it had a photo of you and your daughter. She met his eyes. I didn't hire anyone to find you. I didn't track you. I just read what was publicly available, and then I tried to stop thinking about you, and I mostly succeeded until the house next door came up for sale. Ethan looked at the table. The wood grain, the coffee ring from a mug that had been there long enough to leave a mark. He thought, people leave marks without knowing it. That's just what happens. That was not a coincidence, he said. No, it wasn't. She said it without flinching. The house came up for sale in March. I have people who track real estate opportunities for various reasons. I was potentially looking at acquiring commercial property in the Savannah area for a project. When it flagged, She exhaled. I thought about it for a long time. I knew it was a strange choice. Strange, he said, with a flatness that conveyed quite a lot. I know how it sounds. Tell me how it sounds to you. She considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things. It sounds like I was obsessed with someone I'd seen for 10 minutes in a parts store and engineered proximity to make something happen. She held his gaze. That's not what it was. But I understand that from the outside, those two things are hard to distinguish. What was it then? I bought a house I genuinely wanted. I like this neighborhood. I needed a base in Savannah for the work project anyway. That part wasn't invented. She paused. And yes, part of the reason this specific house appealed to me was that it was next door to you. I can't make that not true. And then you just... What? Inserted yourself into my life? The question had an edge, and she didn't deflect it. I introduced myself. I brought coffee. I tried to be a decent neighbor. I didn't manufacture situations. I didn't create reasons to be around you. She leaned forward slightly. Every conversation we had, I didn't engineer those. They happened because you're someone it's easy to talk to, and you were kind enough to let me in. I let you in because I thought you were just my neighbor. I know. Something in her voice cracked slightly, then steadied. I know that. He pushed back from the table and stood up. Not angrily. He didn't have the specific energy for anger yet, which sometimes meant the real anger was still loading somewhere deeper. He walked to the kitchen window and looked out at the yard. The bird feeder she'd put up in June was right there, 20 feet away. He'd looked at it 100 times. Did you know about Lily? He said. The article mentioned her, that you were a single father. Did that factor in somehow? Ethan. Her voice was quiet but firm. No. Lily is a child. She was not a... She stopped herself from whatever she was about to say. No, she had nothing to do with the choice, and everything I feel about her has happened because she knocked on my door and showed me her bird book, and she's a remarkable kid. That part was not planned. He stayed at the window. He heard her chair push back, heard her stand. I should have told you, she said. I know I should have. I thought about it 100 times. I kept thinking... She paused. Every time I almost said it, I thought about how it would land, and I was afraid. That's the honest reason. I was afraid that if I told you, everything we'd built would just... A pause. Collapse into something you couldn't get past. So you kept it from me to protect what we had, he said to the window. I kept it from me to protect what I had, she corrected quietly. That's more honest. I was protecting myself. He turned around then. She was standing by the table, arms at her sides, doing nothing with her hands, which was unusual for her. Exposed. The word that came to him was exposed. She looked like someone who had taken off armor they'd been wearing long enough that being without it was physically uncomfortable. He recognized that. He'd walked around in that same uncomfortable skin for 2 years after the divorce. I need to think, he said. She nodded. I'm not... He stopped, because what he'd been about to say was, I'm not angry, but that wasn't precisely true. He was something. It wasn't pure anger. It was the particular feeling of finding out that the ground under your feet has a different shape than you thought it did. I need some time. Okay, she said. I'm going to go work. Okay. He walked to the back door, stopped with his hand on the frame. Was any of it... He didn't finish the sentence because there were too many ways to finish it, and he wasn't sure he wanted any of the answers yet. No, Victoria said, and he hadn't even asked the question, but she'd understood it. None of it was. Not one thing. He went back through the gate and into the garage, and he pulled the roller door most of the way down, which he never did during the day, and he sat on the concrete floor next to the Mustang for a while. The orange paint was very bright under the overhead lights. He thought about what she'd said. He thought about Nicole, who had shown up on his doorstep with the kind of carefully parceled information that was designed to do maximum damage without exposing the person delivering it. Nicole had known exactly what she was doing. The question was how she'd found out, and the answer to that was probably not complicated. Money moved in certain circles, information about who was doing what got passed around, and if Nicole was looking for a reason to create leverage, she'd probably been looking for a while before she found one. He thought about the parts store in Pooler. He could picture it exactly. A fluorescent-lit place off the highway with pegboard walls and a counter guy named Dennis, who'd been there since about 1994. He'd been in there probably a dozen times. He thought about whether he would have noticed a woman coming in while he was mid-conversation about a carburetor, and the honest answer was almost certainly not. He was talking about the carburetor. He thought about Victoria sitting in her car in the parking lot, or maybe standing in the aisle, listening to him describe the difference between the original Rochester Quadrajet and the aftermarket alternatives. He thought about the fact that she'd been thinking about him for over a year before she ever said his name, and he didn't know whether that was the most unsettling thing he'd ever heard or something else entirely. He sat on the concrete floor until his phone buzzed again from Darren, at which point he got up, unlocked the back office, called the Camaro client, and then went through the motions of an afternoon's work in a way that was technically fine and emotionally somewhere else. Darren arrived at 2 and took one look at him and said nothing, which was one of Darren's better qualities. They worked. The Camaro's brake situation was resolved and documented. The Mustang's interior was confirmed for delivery Thursday from the reupholstery shop in Augusta. Ethan wrote 2 emails, reviewed a supplier invoice, and did not look through the fence once. At 4:30, Darren said, "You want to talk about it?" "No." "Okay." A pause. "Is it the ex-wife thing?" "Partially." Another pause. "The neighbor?" Ethan looked at him. "I'm not blind," Darren said, "or stupid. I know that. She seems like a good person. She kept something from me." "Yeah." Darren wiped down a wrench. "Everybody keeps something from somebody. Questions usually whether the thing they kept is the kind of thing that changes what you know about them." "This is something that changes what I know about the beginning," Ethan said. "About how we met. About why she was here." Darren thought about that for a moment in the particular way he thought about things. Slow and honest and without the impulse to fill silence. "Does it change what happened after that?" Ethan didn't answer, which Darren correctly interpreted as meaning he was thinking about it. "I'm going to go get dinner," Darren said. "You should eat something." He left, and Ethan sat with the question Darren had left behind, which was inconveniently good. Does it change what happened after that? The tree in the storm. August at 11 p.m., Victoria soaked in her raincoat, looking lost in a way that felt genuine, because if it had been performed, she was the greatest actress in the history of the coastal South. The way she'd stayed on the stool in the garage while he vented about Nicole's phone call and not offered him useless comfort. The drawing she'd made of the Mustang's front quarter and handed over without making anything of it, which was still on his tool bench under the left corner of his Mustang service file. The question she'd asked on his porch in September, the one about the building with the solid foundation and the damage above the waterline, which he understood now had been her trying to tell him without telling him. None of that changed, but the context changed, and context changed the color of things even when the things themselves were the same. That was just true. He drove to pick up Lily from school at 6. She'd had an after-school thing about birds, of all things. The girl was going to be an ornithologist, or he was going to have to learn a lot more about birds. And she came out of the community center talking about red-tailed hawks at a pace that required no participation from him, just occasional nodding. At dinner he was quiet, and she watched him with those eyes. "What's wrong?" she said. "Nothing." "Daddy." "I'm tired, Lily." She looked at him for a long moment. She had her mother's eyes and his nose, and somehow his ex-wife's ability to read people, which felt unfair on most days. "Is it about Victoria?" He looked at his daughter. Why would it be about Victoria? Because she looked sad today. She pushed a piece of chicken around her plate. I waved at her when I was leaving for school, and she waved back, but she looked sad. He didn't say anything. "Did you fight?" Lily asked. "We didn't fight." "But something happened." "Lily." He said her name gently, which was the signal they had for this is not a conversation we're having right now. She accepted it because she was generally perceptive about when pushing would make things worse. She went back to her chicken and talked about red-tailed hawks, and he listened and felt the weight of the day settling into his shoulders like sediment. After Lily was in bed, he sat on the porch alone for the first time in what felt like months. The porch felt bigger than he remembered it being. The stool Victoria usually sat on was still there. He didn't look at it. He looked at the yard instead, the fence line, the darkness beyond it. He thought, she chose to tell me the truth today when she could have kept lying. He thought, the first lie of omission went on for 5 months. That's a long time to keep a thing. He thought, but Nicole showed up knowing exactly what she was doing, and whatever information Nicole had, she used it as a weapon, not a kindness. He thought about what that said about each of them. His phone had 3 messages from Nicole that he hadn't opened. He didn't open them now. He put the phone face down on the arm of the chair and looked at the dark yard and thought about what Darren had said and about what Victoria had said and about the fact that the things people chose to hide were not always evidence of bad intent. Sometimes they were evidence of fear, which was a different thing, not better, necessarily, but different. The fear of losing something before you even properly had it. He understood that in a way he didn't entirely want to admit to himself, because he'd been running a version of that same fear since the divorce. Since before the divorce, honestly. The careful way he'd built his life after, the garage, the routine, the managed distances from everyone except his daughter, that was the same thing in a different form. The construction of controlled spaces where damage was limited. He'd been in that garage under the tarp too, covered up, waiting for someone to think he was worth pulling the cover off of. He sat there a long time. Then the porch light next door came on. Victoria came out and sat on her own porch steps without looking over the fence. She had a mug. She wasn't looking his direction. She was looking at her yard. Her posture, the particular upright stillness of someone who is not going to ask for anything but is also not going to pretend. He looked at the fence between them, the gate in it, standing open the way it had been for months, neither of them having thought about who'd started that or why. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. They sat there on opposite sides of the fence in the dark October night, separately and together, in the way that people sometimes were, when they were right in the middle of deciding something. The night insects went on doing their business. An owl called once from the oak tree that had been repaired after the storm. New deck boards, load-bearing beam replaced, wood that smelled clean and green still when the afternoon sun hit it right. He thought, the foundation is solid. He thought, everything else is just work. He didn't go over the fence that night. He went inside and he slept badly, and in the morning he made Lily's breakfast and put her on the bus and went to the garage and pulled the roller door up and stood in front of the Mustang in her finished orange paint and looked at the car that had started as something broken and lost and covered up, and which was now, undeniably, itself. His phone sat on the workbench with Nicole's 3 unread messages. He picked it up, opened the first message. I have documentation. I know a lawyer. You should think carefully about what you're going to do here. The second, the Ashford woman has been lying to you since the day she showed up. I can prove it. The third, sent at 11 p.m. Call me back, Ethan. This isn't finished. He read all 3 and set the phone down. He thought about the word documentation and what it might mean in Nicole's hands, and he felt something shift in his stomach that wasn't fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. Because if Nicole had actual documentation, not just gossip, not just inference, but actual records of what Victoria had done and when, that was a different weight in the equation. He thought about calling his lawyer, Dave Kellerman, who was a decent man who charged reasonable rates and had handled the divorce without anyone getting destroyed. He'd probably need to anyway about the Mustang claim. He thought about calling Victoria. He did neither. He put his phone in his pocket, picked up his tools, and started on the Mustang's final inspection. He worked his way from the front end back, checking every connection, every alignment, every component he'd rebuilt or replaced. His hands knew what to do even when his head was loud. He was under the car checking the exhaust clearance when he heard footsteps. He rolled out on the creeper and found himself looking up at Darren, who was holding 2 coffees from the place on Broughton Street. You're early, Ethan said. I got the sense you'd be here early. He handed down a cup. How are you doing? I'm under a car. I can see that. Darren sat on the milk crate. You decided anything? Ethan sat up, back against the Mustang's rocker panel. Not yet. She called me, Darren said. Ethan looked at him. Victoria? No, your ex. Darren's voice was flat. She got my number from somewhere. Said she wanted to give me a heads up about, quote, what was really going on with your employer. He took a drink of his coffee. I told her I wasn't interested in her heads up, and I hung up. Something cold moved through Ethan. She called you. Yep. She doesn't have your number. She does now, apparently. Darren's expression was the careful neutral he used when he had a strong opinion and was choosing not to volunteer it. She's working hard at this. I know. Ethan looked at the concrete floor, the oil stains, the scuff marks, the particular geography of a space that had been worked in for years. Did she say anything about the documentation? She said she had evidence. She said Victoria Ashford's interest in you was... She used the word calculated. A pause. She seemed to think that word would mean more than it did. Ethan was quiet. For what it's worth, Darren said carefully, calculated and wrong aren't always the same thing. Ethan looked at him. I'm just saying. He finished his coffee. I watched that woman sit in your garage for months. I watched her when you weren't paying attention. That's not... People don't fake that. The way she watched you work." He shook his head. "She wasn't running a con. I don't know what she was doing exactly, but it wasn't that." Ethan turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She made a bad choice about honesty," Darren continued. "She should have told you, but the reason she didn't wasn't because she was using you. The reason she didn't was because she couldn't figure out how to keep you if she did." He shrugged, like this was obvious. "That's a scared person problem, not a con artist problem." Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "When did you get so insightful?" he said finally. "I've been divorced twice," Darren said. "You learn to read people or you run out of patience." He got up and went to the Camaro, and Ethan went back under the Mustang, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did. By noon, the final inspection was done. The car was finished. He sat in the Mustang's driver's seat, careful of the new upholstery, and put both hands on the wheel. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled from the final test run. The interior smelled like fresh leather and history. He thought about Daniel Reeves, who'd bought this car when he was 22 and kept it in a garage for decades, never quite getting to the work. Not because he didn't care, because he cared enough that the idea of doing it wrong was scarier than not doing it at all. Ethan understood that now in a way he hadn't when he first pulled the tarp off. He got out of the car. He walked out of the garage and through the gate that was standing open between the properties and knocked on Victoria's back door. She answered. She looked like she'd slept about as well as he had, which was to say not well. She was holding her coffee in both hands the way people held things when they needed the warmth of them. "Nicole called Darren," he said. Victoria closed her eyes briefly. "I'm sorry. She said she has documentation about you, about the choice to move here." "She might." Victoria's voice was steady but thin. "I'm not..." She stopped. "I'm a public figure in certain circles. There are records of property purchases. There are records of business travel. If she talked to the right people or paid the right people, she might have something that looks..." She stopped again. "That looks like what she's saying it is." "Is it what she's saying it is?" "Depends on what she's saying." She held his gaze. "I made a choice to move next door to you, Ethan. I can't make that not be true. Whether it was calculated or whether it was just a decision made by someone who hadn't stopped thinking about a stranger in a parts store for over a year," she exhaled. "I can't make those two things look different from the outside. They look the same." He looked at her for a long time. "She's going to take this somewhere," he said. "She's going to try to turn this into something that hurts the Mustang deal. Maybe something that hurts the custody arrangement. She's going to use whatever she has." "I know. And I need to know..." He stopped. Started again. "I need to know who I'm actually dealing with. Not just what I've seen over the fence, the real version." Victoria put her coffee down on the counter behind her. She turned back and looked at him with something that was very tired and very direct at once. "What do you want to know?" "Everything," he said. "All of it. From the beginning." She nodded once. "Then come inside," she said. "It's going to take a while." He came inside. The gate between the properties stayed open. She made fresh coffee first. He didn't ask her to. She just went to the pour-over set up on the counter and started the process with the focused deliberateness she brought to everything, and he sat at the kitchen table and watched her and didn't say anything. There was something in the ritual of it that he understood. When you needed to say something hard, it helped to have something to do with your hands first. The morning light came through the east window, the way it always did at this hour. He knew this kitchen's light now. That felt significant in a way he didn't want to think about directly. She set the coffee in front of him and sat down with her own cup. She didn't put anything between them on the table. No phone, no laptop, no sketchbook. She just sat there with her hands around her mug and looked at him steadily, and he understood she was ready to answer whatever he asked. "Start from before the parts store," he said. She nodded. She took one drink of her coffee, then set it down and began. She'd grown up in Connecticut, she told him, not wealthy. Her parents were both teachers, her mother middle school English, her father high school chemistry, and they'd done fine, but fine in the way that meant you watched what you spent and you didn't take things for granted. She'd been good at math in the way that changed the direction of a life. Engineering scholarship at Georgia Tech, then a master's, then a project that became a company that she and her roommate built in a spare bedroom, and which she'd eventually sold for a number she still had trouble saying out loud without feeling like it belonged to someone else. The money arrived fast, she said, too fast to fully process. One day I'm working 16 hours in a spare bedroom, and the next I have more money than my parents will see in several lifetimes combined, and she stopped. It changes things. Not who you are necessarily, but it changes the room around you, the way people stand in a room with you. How so? Ethan asked, not because he couldn't guess, but because he wanted to hear it from her. They stop disagreeing with you, she said. Even people who disagree with you stop saying so. You become someone to be managed rather than someone to talk to. You're a resource or a connection or a problem to be handled carefully. She turned her mug. I built a second company because I needed something real to think about, not because I needed the money. Because without the work, I was… She paused. I was a name in a room and nothing else. He thought about that. The inverse of his own situation. He'd spent years being a person without much recognition, and the invisibility had been its own kind of weight. She'd had all the recognition and found it hollow. Same loneliness, different container. So you went back to work, he said. I went back to work. Infrastructure. The second company was always what I actually cared about. Bridges, water systems, the stuff that nobody thinks about until it stops working. I hired people I trusted, and I traveled a lot, and I was good at the work. She looked at the table. And I was alone in a way that the work didn't fix. I dated a few times, seriously even, once. A pause. He was in finance. He was attentive and successful, and after 8 months I realized he was in love with the idea of the business I'd built, and not particularly interested in anything I thought about at 11 o'clock at night. What do you think about at 11 o'clock at night? Ethan asked. She looked up. Something in her expression shifted to something less guarded. The way water moves through systems, whether a load-bearing calculation I ran last week was conservative enough, whether the foreman on the Phoenix project is managing the crew properly. A small pause. Lily's bird book. What kind of coffee I should try. Whether the thing I said in a meeting last Tuesday was actually as clear as I thought it was at the time. She met his eyes. You, for the last few months. The honesty of it landed without any cushioning. He held it. Tell me about the parts store, he said. She told him again, but with more detail than yesterday. She'd been in Savannah for a 2-day consultation on a water reclamation feasibility study for the county. She'd taken a wrong exit and ended up on a road in Pooler she didn't know, and the rattle in the rental car had been there since the airport. She'd stopped because the alternative was to worry about it for the rest of the day, and she couldn't afford the cognitive load. You were at the counter, she said. You were describing what you needed and why. The guy behind the counter, Dennis, I think. Dennis, Ethan confirmed. He kept suggesting alternatives, cheaper options. You kept explaining, very patiently, exactly why the alternative wouldn't perform the same way under operating conditions. You knew the engineering of it. She looked at him. You weren't being difficult. You just knew what was right, and you weren't going to accept something less because it was easier. He remembered that trip to the parts store. He remembered arguing with Dennis about the carburetor. He did not remember her. I asked about my rattle, and Dennis said it was a loose heat shield, and I should just drive it, and it was fine. A small, brief smile. He was right. I drove it, and it was fine. And I stood in the aisle for a minute after he'd gone back to you, and I watched you. Not in a… She stopped. I wasn't staring. I just listened to you explain the difference between 2 carburetors to a man who was clearly ready for you to stop talking about it, and the patience you had, not performing patience, actually having it, because the information mattered to you. She looked out the window. I left. I sat in the car and thought, who is that? Not in a romantic way, that was a real person. That was a person who actually gave a damn about what they were doing. And then you found the website. And then I found the website and the article. And I spent about 2 hours reading things that were publicly available. And then I thought, okay, this is getting weird. And I closed the laptop and went back to work. But you kept thinking about it. I kept thinking about it. She said it without defensiveness. I've met a lot of people. I've been in rooms with successful people and smart people and powerful people, and I'm not trying to diminish any of that, but she searched for the right words. Most people I meet are performing something, a version of themselves that they think the room needs. Even good people do it. I do it. I know I do it. She looked at him directly. You weren't performing anything. You were just you. In a parts store at 10 in the morning, arguing about a carburetor, completely indifferent to whether anyone was watching or what they thought. I didn't know anyone was watching. I know, that's the whole point. He sat back in his chair. The coffee was good. It was always good. He'd stopped noticing that somewhere around July, and now he noticed it again as a way of noticing how much had become ordinary between them. The house, he said. She exhaled slowly. The house came up in March. My real estate contact flagged it as part of a broader search for Savannah area properties. It was listed as a residential property adjacent to a residential garage. That's how it was described. A pause. I recognized the address from the community article. The street name was in the background of one of the photos. Ethan was quiet for a moment. You recognized the street name from a photo you'd seen once, 5 months before. I have a very good memory for spatial information. She said it without pride, almost apologetically. It's an engineering thing. I remember addresses and maps and layouts. It's useful professionally and occasionally. She paused. Inconvenient otherwise. Okay. He thought about this. So the address flagged for you. And then what? And then I thought about it for 3 weeks before I made an offer. She held his gaze. I want to be very clear about something. I did not buy that house as a scheme. I bought it because I wanted a Savannah property, because the house was genuinely good, the structure, the yard, the neighborhood, and because part of me wanted to live next door to someone who seemed like the kind of person I'd stopped believing I'd find. She paused. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a script. I moved in with furniture and a bird feeder, and I thought, maybe we become neighbors, maybe we become friends, maybe nothing happens, and I at least have a house I like and a city I like. And the introduction. I brought coffee because I'd been awake since 5, and I'd made too much, and I'd been sitting on the porch thinking about you for 3 days, and I needed to just... She stopped. Do something instead of sitting there. You'd been sitting on the porch thinking about me for 3 days. Yes. While I was in the garage 15 feet away not knowing you existed. Essentially, yes. She said it with a flash of something self-aware, so not quite humor, but the edge of it. The recognition that it was, from a certain angle, a lot. I know how this sounds. He looked at her for a long time. He thought about the gate that stood open between their properties. He thought about August in the rain. He thought about September on the porch, and the building with the solid foundation. He thought about her sitting on the stool in the garage all those evenings, not asking for anything, not making anything happen, just being there. Here's what I need to understand, he said carefully. When you came over that first Tuesday, you knew about Lily. Yes. You knew I'd been divorced. Yes. And you came over anyway, knowing all of that. Yes. And you never manufactured a reason to be around me. You never... He stopped and thought about it honestly. Was there anything? Any moment where you created a situation to get closer? She thought about it carefully. He appreciated that she didn't answer immediately. The car breaking down in July, she said. My car didn't break down. He went still. I called you because I needed a reason to... She stopped. No, that's not... She pressed her hand to her forehead for a moment. My car was making a sound I didn't understand. I could have called a tow service. I called you because I wanted to, and I told myself the sound was reason enough. She looked up. I wasn't stranded. I wasn't in any danger. The sound turned out to be nothing. I knew it was probably nothing, but I called you. He thought about that night. Late July, nearly 10 p.m., here on the side of Abercorn Street with the hazards going. He'd gotten there in 15 minutes and spent half an hour going over the car and found a loose heat shield, same as the rental in Pooler, and wasn't that something? And they'd stood on the sidewalk in the summer dark talking for another 40 minutes about nothing in particular, and he'd driven home feeling lighter than he had in months. He'd thought about it afterward. He'd thought about it more than he wanted to admit. "The heat shield," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "The loose heat shield, same thing as the rental car in Pooler, when you first saw me." The color rose in her face. That wasn't—" She stopped. "That's a coincidence." "Is it?" "Ethan." Her voice was slightly strained. "I did not engineer a loose heat shield on my personal vehicle to recreate a scene from a parts store in Pooler 14 months ago. That would be—" She stopped again. He watched her. "That would be insane," she said. "Yeah," he agreed. "It would." A silence that had several things moving through it. "But you did call me instead of the tow service," he said. "Yes," she said quietly. "I did do that." He nodded. He picked up his coffee. He looked out the east window where the morning light was doing something unremarkable and familiar. "Okay," he said. "Okay, what?" "Okay. I understand the timeline. I understand what you did and why." He set the cup down. "Now I need to understand what Nicole has. Because whatever she's planning, she's going to use it, and I need to know what I'm walking into." Victoria's expression shifted into something more businesslike. The specific focus she got when a problem moved from emotional to operational. He'd seen it when she was dealing with the storm damage. She was better at this mode than the other one, and he thought that was probably true for most people. "She likely has the property purchase records," Victoria said. "Those are public. She might have my travel records for the Savannah consultation. If she talked to someone at the hotel or the county office, it wouldn't be hard to establish that I was in Savannah 14 months ago." She paused. "She might have found the article too, the community piece with your address context." "So she can demonstrate you were in Savannah before you moved in," Ethan said. "And she can demonstrate you bought the house next door. And she's going to frame those two things as deliberate targeting of you, yes." A pause. "Which is not entirely wrong. But not for the reason she'll imply." "No." She held his gaze. "She's going to imply I was running some kind of manipulation, that our friendship—" She stopped on the word, they both heard it. "That the relationship was engineered from the start to gain something from you." "What would she say you were trying to gain?" "I don't know, maybe money, maybe social credibility. She might argue I was trying to use a regular person relationship as some kind of public image management." She said it with the flat honesty of someone who'd thought about how they could be characterized and found it mostly absurd and partly devastating. Or maybe she doesn't have a coherent why. Maybe the what is enough. Maybe she knew you before you knew her and she didn't tell you is all she needs. "Because it sounds bad," he said. "Because it sounds bad," she agreed. "And it is bad. I'm not trying to minimize that. I made a choice to not tell you something I should have told you. And I made that choice repeatedly over 5 months, and the reason was fear. And fear is not the same as innocence." She held his gaze steadily. "I'm not asking you to forgive me on a technicality. I'm asking you to understand the difference between what I did and what she'll say I did." He thought about that for a long moment. Outside, a car went past on the street. The bird feeder was visible through the window, and a pair of chickadees were working through the sunflower seeds. "Why didn't you just tell me?" he said. "In the beginning. You introduced yourself and we talked in the garage that first Tuesday. You could have said it then. I think I saw you in a parts store once. I recognized you." He paused. "That's a story that makes sense. People recognize people. That's not crazy." "No," she agreed. "It's not." "So why didn't you say it?" "Because by the time I got to the gate that Tuesday morning, I'd been thinking about you for 14 months. And I'd bought a house next door to you, and saying, 'I think I saw you in a parts store once,' was such a—" She made a frustrated gesture. "It was such a small word for such a large thing. And if I said the small word, I'd be lying by omission. And if I said the large thing, I'd be—" She stopped. "Scaring the hell out of me," he said. "Scaring the hell out of you." She looked at him with something exhausted in her expression. There was no version of the true sentence that came out right. "So I said nothing, and I thought I'd find the right time. And the right time kept not arriving, and eventually 5 months had passed, and the thing I hadn't said had gotten so large that saying it had become its own kind of—" She exhaled. The longer you wait, the worse it gets. Which I knew, and which didn't help. He was quiet for a while. He understood this mechanism well. He'd watched his marriage die in slow motion, partly because both of them kept waiting for the right time to say the real things, and the right time never arrived. Silence accumulated until it had structural weight. "What do you want me to do with all of this?" he said. "I don't want you to do anything," she said immediately. "I'm not asking for something. I'm just—" She stopped. "I told you the truth because you asked me and because you deserved it. What you do with it is yours." That's a very tidy way to hand the whole problem back to me. "I know." A small, unhappy pause. "I'm aware it's not fair. I created a complicated situation, and now I'm asking you to be the one who decides what it means." She looked at the table. "I don't have a better option. I can't undo the choice I made. I can only tell you that everything that happened between us, every conversation, every evening on the porch, the storm, the Mustang—" She stopped. "None of that was strategy. If I had a strategy, I'd have been better at telling you the truth." He almost laughed at that. Almost. He caught it, held it, let it settle into something that wasn't quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. "The car breaking down," he said. "I'm sorry about that. You called me instead of a tow service, and it was a loose heat shield." "Yes." "Identical to the rental car in Pooler. I promise you I did not—" "I believe you." He said it quietly. "I just need you to understand that from where I'm sitting, that's—" He shook his head. "That's quite a thing." Something shifted in her expression, not relief, just something letting go slightly. "It is quite a thing," she agreed. He stood up from the table. He wasn't ready to be done with this conversation, but he needed to move, needed to not be sitting still with all of it pressing in from the walls of her kitchen. He walked to the window and looked at the bird feeder, and the chickadees were gone now, replaced by a single tufted titmouse who was working through the seeds with great seriousness. "Nicole's going to move on the Mustang," he said. "Probably. She can't win, legally, but she can make it expensive and slow, and she can make the sale complicated if there's any perception of irregularity around the project." "I know." A pause. "Do you want my help?" He turned from the window. "What kind of help?" "Legal. If you need it, I have—" She stopped. "I have access to very good lawyers. I'm not trying to throw money at your problem. I'm saying that if she's coming at you because she found something about me, then part of this is my responsibility to address." "I have a lawyer," he said. "I know, but mine eat people like Nicole's lawyer for breakfast and don't bill by the hour." She said it without apology. "That's not a boast. It's a practical offer." He looked at her. The offer was genuine, practically speaking. It was also complicated in ways he'd have to think through. "Let me call Dave first," he said. Dave Kellerman, who handled divorces and small business disputes and who he'd trusted for 3 years. "Then we'll see what we're dealing with." "Okay." He picked up his jacket from the chair where he'd left it when he'd come in. He looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked back at him with the expression she'd had since yesterday morning, careful, tired, not asking for anything. "I'm not done being angry," he said. It seemed important to say that clearly. "I know. And I don't know yet what I think about all of this." "I know that too. But I wanted to hear it from you, and I did, and I think—" He stopped and made himself say the rest of it honestly. "I think you're telling me the truth now. I don't know what to do with all of it, but I believe you're telling the truth." She held very still for a moment. "That matters," she said quietly. "That matters to me." He left through the back door, and the gate was still open. He called Dave Kellerman from the garage, explained the situation with the deliberate concision of someone who'd learned that lawyers billed by how long you talked. Dave was quiet through most of it, asking 2 or 3 pointed questions, and then said what Ethan had expected him to say. Nicole had no viable claim, but that didn't mean she couldn't cause problems if she was willing to invest in causing them. "The question is what documentation she actually has," Dave said. "Neighbors' purchase records and travel history. That's circumstantial, and it's not your problem legally. If she's trying to tie it to the Mustang claim, she's going to need something showing actual financial entanglement between you and Ms. Ashford, And from what you're telling me, there isn't any. There isn't any. Then she's posturing. It's expensive posturing, but it's still posturing. A pause. Send me whatever she's sent you. I want to see what she's working with. She hasn't sent anything formal yet, just text. Forward the text, and Ethan, Dave paused. Don't talk to her again without me knowing. You start engaging directly, and she'll use that. He texted the screenshots to Dave and put the phone in his pocket and went to work on the Mustang's final detailing, which was the kind of methodical close-up work that his hands could do without requiring much from the rest of him. Buffing chrome, cleaning the engine bay. The particular satisfaction of making every visible inch of a finished car matched the quality of the work underneath. Darren arrived at noon and was told the situation in a condensed version, which he received with minimal reaction, and then said, "So she called me and she's going after the sale. That's a lot of energy for an ex-wife." "Nicole does things fully," Ethan said. Darren looked at the Mustang. "Car's done." "Car's done." "It's something," Darren said, and he meant it, and Ethan heard it the way it was meant. He called Daniel Reeves's daughter that afternoon. Her name was Margaret, she was 53, she lived in Macon, and she cried for a full minute when he described the grabber orange coming back under the respray. He held the phone and waited and didn't say anything because there wasn't anything useful to say, and sometimes waiting was the right thing. "Can I come see it?" she asked. "Any time. She's ready." Margaret said she'd come Saturday, and she sounded like a woman who'd been holding something heavy for a long time and could finally see where to set it down. He spent Thursday in a state of suspended motion. Work happening, the days moving, but everything else sitting in the particular stillness of a decision not yet made. He picked Lily up from school. He made dinner. He sat on the porch that evening, and the porch light next door came on and went off, and he didn't see her, and he didn't know if that was her respecting the space he'd asked for or her own uncertainty about what came next. Probably both. Friday morning was when Nicole's documentation arrived. It came to Dave's office first, then Dave called him. "She has more than I expected," Dave said, and his voice had the quality of a man choosing words carefully. "Not more than we can handle, but more than posturing." "Tell me." "Property purchase records for the Ashford house, showing the acquisition in March. Travel records from a Savannah hotel, February of last year. Not March, February. So she's claiming Ms. Ashford was in Savannah more than once before the move. There's a document," a pause. "There's a document that appears to be an internal communication from a real estate research service. It lists your address and notes it as a point of interest adjacent to the target property." Ethan was sitting on the workbench stool in the garage. He looked at the Mustang. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means when Ms. Ashford's people were doing property research, your address was flagged as contextual information about the neighborhood. It's standard research, but taken out of context, it looks like she was researching me specifically." "That's how Nicole's lawyer will present it. Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment. He thought about what Victoria had said yesterday morning. "I didn't hire anyone to find you. I didn't track you." And he still believed that. But the real estate research firm doing normal due diligence had apparently noted his garage as a feature of the property landscape, which was also normal, but which Nicole's lawyer would characterize as something else entirely. "What do we do?" Ethan said. "We get a statement from Ms. Ashford about the property research process. We get the real estate firm to clarify what that notation meant, which should be easy because it's standard practice. And then we let Nicole's lawyer figure out that they have circumstantial evidence of a personal choice, not a conspiracy, not financial fraud, not grounds for any claim on the Mustang." Dave paused. "But I need to ask you something directly, Ethan." "Go ahead." "Is there any financial arrangement between you and Victoria Ashford? Any loan, any gift, any investment in the restoration project, anything at all?" "No," Ethan said. "She's never given you money for the work?" "She paid $40 for supplies after the storm and I gave it back." A brief pause. "Good. That's clean. She's going to argue the money's influence is implicit, that you've received non-financial benefits from the relationship that represent compensation. That argument is weak. But I need you to know that's where she's going." After the call, he sat in the garage for 20 minutes without moving. Then he walked next door. Victoria was at her drafting table when she came to the back door. There was a pencil stuck behind her ear, and she had the distracted look of someone pulled out of concentrated work. And she looked at him, and the distraction cleared immediately. "Dave called," he said. "Nicole has a document from a real estate research firm. It shows your people flagged my address during property due diligence." She closed her eyes briefly. The market analysis. Was that routine? Completely. She stepped back from the door. "Come in. I'll show you." He came in. She went to her laptop and pulled up a file she had ready, which told him she'd been anticipating this, and he wasn't sure how he felt about that. And then he decided that a woman who anticipated problems was probably more useful than one who didn't. She turned the laptop to face him. "Every property acquisition I make goes through a market analysis that includes a half-mile radius context report. That means nearby businesses, residential density, traffic patterns, noise sources." She pointed at the screen. "Your garage is a business operating adjacent to the residential property. It would have appeared in any context report for that property, regardless of whether I'd ever set foot in a parts store." He looked at the document on the screen. It was exactly what she'd described. A formatted report with property features, neighborhood data, and a list of nearby commercial operations. Cross Restoration was listed with its business category, approximate square footage of the commercial structure, and operating hours. No personal information, no mention of him by name. "This is a property report," he said. "Yes." "It's a property report with my garage on it." "Yes, because my garage is next door to your garage." She held his gaze. "Ethan, if you'd bought any property in this neighborhood, that report would have had Cross Restoration on it. It has nothing to do with you personally." He looked at the document and then at her. Nicole's lawyer is going to say whatever Nicole is paying them to say." Her voice was flat and tired. "That's their job. But Dave is right that it's weak. It's a standard market analysis document that any competent real estate attorney can contextualize in about 4 minutes. She's going to make it a story," Ethan said. "I know. She's going to say you had my address before you moved in. She's going to say you were tracking me." "I know. And even if it's wrong, it's going to sound like what she wants it to sound like." Victoria closed the laptop. She stood and put her hands on the drafting table. "Let me ask you something, not about the legal situation." She looked at him directly. "When you think about the last 5 months, everything that actually happened between us, do any of it feel like a setup? Does any specific moment feel manufactured to you?" He thought about it honestly, which she deserved. He went through it. The first coffee, the first morning in the garage, the storm, the late nights talking, the times she'd been on her porch when he was working and they'd called back and forth over the fence without either of them planning to. The things she'd remembered, the things she'd said that no one had said to him in a long time. "No," he said. "Then hold on to that," she said, "because Nicole isn't attacking what actually happened. She's attacking the prologue. And the prologue," she stopped. "The prologue is complicated, and I own that, and I should have handled it differently. But the story itself," she looked at him. "The story is the same regardless of what she brings." He looked at her for a long moment. "She's coming Saturday," he said. "Margaret Reeves, to see the Mustang." The shift in Victoria's expression was immediate and unperformed, away from the legal discussion into something quieter. "That's a big day." "Yeah. Are you ready?" He thought about Daniel Reeves's car and its grabber orange paint. He thought about Margaret crying on the phone. He thought about the thing his work was, the particular honor of being trusted with the machines that carried memory. "Ready as I get," he said. She nodded. Then she said carefully, "I'd like to be there, if that's okay. I don't have to be. I can stay inside, but you can be there," he said. The words came out before he'd fully decided to say them, which told him something. She nodded again, and something in her face was very careful and very grateful, and she didn't make a production of it. He went back through the gate. He stood in the garage and looked at the Mustang. He thought, Nicole is going to come at this hard. He thought, the legal situation is manageable. He thought, The thing between Victoria and me is not a legal situation and cannot be managed in the same way, and I already know what I think about it, but I haven't quite admitted that to myself yet. He thought about Margaret Reeves coming to see her father's car. He thought about all the things that waited under tarps until someone came along who cared enough to look. He went to the tool chest and pulled out the detailing cloth and started on the Mustang's chrome one more time. Because perfect wasn't possible, but better was always available. And you did what you could with what you had. And tomorrow Margaret would come and he would hand her the keys, and that would close something. And then something else would have to open. He worked until it was dark. Margaret Reeves arrived at 10:15 on a Saturday morning in a green sedan that had seen better decades, and she sat in her car for a full 4 minutes before she got out. Ethan watched from just inside the garage, not wanting to rush her. He understood the pause. Sometimes you needed a moment before the thing you'd been waiting for actually happened, because once it happened, it stopped being something you were moving toward and became something you'd have to live with. Margaret was 53 years old, and her father had been gone 8 months, and she was about to see the car he'd loved for 50 years fully restored for the first time. The 4 minutes in the car made complete sense. Lily was sitting on the front porch with her bird book, which she'd brought outside with the instinct of someone who understood that this morning was for the adults, and she should occupy herself accordingly. Darren had come in for a half day, even though it was Saturday, because he'd worked on this car too, and had his own stake in the ending of it. Victoria was in the side yard with a cup of coffee and her sketchbook, close enough to be present, but not so close as to crowd the moment. Ethan had noticed her position when he'd opened the bay doors that morning and thought that she understood, instinctively, exactly how much space to take up and when. He hadn't said anything about it. He just noticed. When Margaret got out of the car, she was a medium-height woman with her father's eyes. He'd seen photos in the community article, and she was wearing a blouse she'd clearly dressed up in, which hit him somewhere unexpected. She'd put on a good blouse to come see her father's car. He had to look at the floor of the garage for a moment. "Mr. Cross," she said, coming up the driveway. "Ethan," he said. "Please." She nodded. She looked at the garage bay where the Mustang sat in the October morning light, and she stopped walking. The grabber orange was something else in natural light. It always had been. That particular shade from 1969 was designed to be visible, to announce itself. And after 50 years under a bad respray and a tarp, it came out of the restoration doing exactly what it was built to do. The chrome caught the morning sun. The interior through the windshield was deep brown leather and original gauges and the kind of detail work that didn't announce itself, but was there if you looked. Margaret put her hand over her mouth. "Take your time," Ethan said. She stood there for a moment. Then she walked forward slowly, the way people approach things they were almost afraid to touch. She went around the driver's side, trailing one hand lightly along the fender without quite making contact, like she was feeling the air around it. She stopped at the rear quarter panel and looked at the Mach 1 stripes, black, the way they were supposed to be. And then she made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something else entirely. "He bought it when he was 22, she said. "He always told the story the same way. He'd saved for 2 years working construction summers, and he walked into a dealership in Atlanta and the salesman said, 'Son, what do you want?' And my father said he wanted that one, just like that. Didn't even know what it was called, just pointed. And he bought it on the spot." She paused. "He said it was the most impulsive thing he'd ever done. He was proud of it for the rest of his life." "He had good instincts," Ethan said. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were wet, but she wasn't crying, the way some people manage to be right at the edge of it without going over. "He said the same about people. He could tell in about 30 seconds if someone was worth knowing." Ethan didn't say anything to that. "Can I sit in it?" she asked. "That's your car," he said. She opened the driver's door. He'd checked the alignment 3 times. It swung perfectly. And she sat down in the driver's seat and put both hands on the steering wheel and looked through the windshield at the back wall of the garage. She sat like that for a while. Darren had disappeared somewhere into the second bay with excellent timing. Lily was still on the porch. Ethan stood by the garage door and gave her the room. After a few minutes, she got out. "What happens now?" she said. "In terms of the process?" "We list it," he said. I have relationships with 2 collectors and 1 auction house that handles significant American muscle. Car like this, properly documented, original color confirmed with paint analysis. You're looking at a strong number. He paused. But that's your call. You might want to keep it. She looked at the car. My apartment has no garage, she said, and I can't drive a manual transmission. A small, watery laugh. Dad tried to teach me 3 times. I never got it. She looked at Ethan. He'd want it with someone who drives it, not sitting. We'll find the right buyer, he said. Someone who'll use it the way it was meant to be used. She nodded. Then she said, How much? He'd run the numbers carefully, cross-referenced with recent comparable sales, talked to both collectors and the auction house. He told her the range, conservative to optimistic. Margaret Reeves sat down on the milk crate stool, Lily's stool, and looked at the floor. She stopped. That's a lot of money. It's a significant car, Ethan said, properly done. He never knew it was worth that. He knew it was worth doing right. She looked up at him. That's a kind thing to say. It's just true. They went inside the house to handle the paperwork. Margaret had brought documents, organized in a folder she'd clearly prepared carefully, and Victoria, without being asked, appeared at the kitchen door to offer coffee and then quietly retreated again. Lily came in for her own juice and introduced herself to Margaret with the focused politeness she produced for important occasions, then went back outside. Your daughter's lovely, Margaret said, signing the restoration completion documents. She has her moments, Ethan said, which was both the truth and the understatement of several years. By noon, the paperwork was done, the car was photographed for the listing, and Margaret had walked around the Mustang 3 more times. On the last circuit, she stopped at the driver's door again and put her palm flat against the roof, just for a moment, just resting it there. And then she took her hand away and straightened up, and she was done. Thank you, she said to Ethan at the end of the driveway, for carrying what it was supposed to be. He shook her hand. She drove away in her green sedan, and he stood in the driveway until she turned the corner, and then he went back into the garage and stood next to the Mustang alone for a minute. Then Victoria appeared at the garage doorway with 2 cups of coffee, and she handed him one without saying anything, and he took it, and they stood side by side looking at the car. Good morning, she said finally. Yeah, he said. It was. They stood there a while longer. The chrome on the passenger mirror, she said. You redid that 3 times. 4, he said. It shows. He drank his coffee. She drank hers. Outside, Lily had migrated from the porch to the backyard, and they could hear her talking to herself in the running commentary she kept up when she thought no one could hear. Something about feathers and migration patterns. This was the moment, Ethan knew. This was the specific Saturday morning moment where the Mustang was done and Margaret had come and gone, and the thing he'd been carrying since Tuesday was still sitting in his chest, waiting for him to decide what to do with it. The comfortable habit of standing here with Victoria in the garage had been trying to make it feel like nothing had changed, and he couldn't let it do that, because things had changed and pretending otherwise would just push the reckoning down the road. I've been thinking, he said. I know. I don't mean about Tuesday, he paused. I mean, I've been thinking about all of it, the whole, he searched for the right word, the whole shape of it. She was quiet, holding her coffee, looking at the Mustang. Here's what I keep coming back to, he said. You told me more about who I was than most people who've known me for years. The carburetor conversation in Pooler. You watched me argue about a carburetor, and you thought about it for a year, and I know that sounds unusual, she supplied. Unusual, sure. He looked at the car. But the thing is, you weren't wrong about what you saw. You saw something real. You just saw it before I knew you were looking. A pause. And then you spent 5 months showing me who you actually were, not performing, not managing me, just being who you were in the space between us. She still didn't say anything. He got the sense she was being careful not to fill the space. The thing I couldn't get past was the not telling, he said. It made me question the whole thing, whether I'd been played, whether the friendship was a costume for something else. He stopped. And then I kept coming back to the storm, August, the way you looked when the tree came down. That's not a flattering memory, she said quietly. No, it's a real one. He turned to look at her directly. You looked like someone who'd gotten hit by something they weren't ready for. And that's not, you can't fake that. I've known people who fake vulnerability, and it looks different, smaller, more deliberate. He shook his head. You were just a person standing in the rain looking at your broken porch. She was looking at him now. I'm still angry, he said. I want to be clear about that. 5 months is a long time to carry something and not say it. And I understand why you did it, but understanding it and being fine with it aren't the same thing. I'm going to need time. Okay, she said, but I don't... He stopped, started again. I don't think you were running a con. I think you made a complicated choice a year ago, and then you made the harder choice of not telling me about it. And both of those things were mistakes, and I think you know that. He paused. And I think the rest of it was real. I think every cup of coffee and every evening and every conversation was real. Victoria was looking at him with an expression he hadn't seen on her before. Not composed, not performing steadiness. Just there. Fully there. In the way she usually managed to be there for everything except, apparently, the most direct versions of the things she actually felt. Yes, she said. It was. Okay, he said. Okay? Okay, as in, I hear you, I believe you, and I don't know yet what happens next, but I'm not done. He looked at the Mustang, then back at her. Does that make sense? Yes, she said. Her voice was slightly rough at the edges. That makes complete sense. He nodded. She nodded. They stood there another minute with their coffee and the grabber orange car between them like a completed sentence. Nicole's going to move next week, he said, because the other thing couldn't wait forever. I know, my lawyers are ready. She said it carefully. If you'll let them work with Dave. Dave already said yes. He'd had that conversation Thursday afternoon, and Dave had used the phrase, this is not even close to a fight, with the quiet confidence of a man who had seen actually close fights and knew the difference. She's going to send a formal demand letter. Dave says to expect it Monday or Tuesday. And then it goes nowhere and she goes away, Victoria said. Hopefully. She will, Victoria said with a certainty that wasn't arrogance. There's nothing there. I've had my legal team go through every document she could have access to. There is no financial connection between us. There is no manipulation of the restoration project. There is nothing that constitutes anything except a woman who made an unusual personal choice about where to live and didn't tell her neighbor about the full context of that choice. A pause. That's embarrassing. It's not actionable. She's going to try to make it public, Ethan said. If the legal route fails, she'll try to make a story out of it, try to damage the sale, make me look... He stopped. Like someone who was taken advantage of, Victoria said. He looked at her. Yes. Would that be the worst thing? She said quietly. If people thought that? Temporarily? He thought about it. He thought about the Mustang sale, which was the more pressing financial concern. He thought about clients and reputation and the small ecosystem of trust that a restoration business ran on. He thought about Lily, who was 9 years old and went to school with kids who had parents who listened to gossip. Yeah, he said, it would. Then we control the narrative, Victoria said, not aggressively, just factually. Dave issues a statement if it comes to that. I don't hide. We don't hide. She paused on that word, and he heard her pause on it. If she wants to make a story out of the fact that your neighbor turned out to be someone who'd seen you before and didn't say so, let her make that story. Because the story also includes 5 months of genuine... She stopped. Genuine whatever this is. He almost smiled. He caught it and held it. Genuine whatever this is. I'm being precise, she said, with a faint edge of self-deprecation. I don't want to name it without your input on the naming. He looked at her for a moment. She was being careful. He understood why she was being careful. The thing she was being careful with was the same thing he was still deciding about, and both of them knew it, and neither of them was going to rush it. We'll deal with Nicole when she moves, he said. And in the meantime, he paused. Is the coffee offer still standing? In the mornings? Something moved through her expression, careful relief. Yes, she said. It's standing. Okay, he said. Then that's where we are. He finished his coffee. She finished hers. The morning went on. The formal demand letter arrived Tuesday, as Dave had predicted. It was 3 pages of carefully constructed language that added up to the claim that Ethan Cross was entitled to no proceeds from the sale of the 1969 Mustang Mach 1 until questions of financial entanglement between him and Victoria Ashford were formally resolved, on the grounds that said entanglement potentially represented undisclosed compensation constituting an interest in the project. Dave called Ethan while he was reading it. "Read the 3rd paragraph on page 2, Dave said. Ethan found it. It cited the real estate research document, the market analysis that had included Cross Restoration as a nearby commercial property, and characterized it as evidence of a targeted relationship between Victoria Ashford and Ethan Cross predating the restoration project and potentially constituting a financial advisory relationship. "She's saying Victoria was advising me on the business," Ethan said. "She's implying it," Dave said, "without saying it, because saying it would require evidence, which doesn't exist." A pause. "This is everything she has, Ethan. This is the whole play, right here in these 3 pages. It's not a lot." "It sounds like a lot when I read it." "That's what lawyers are paid to make sound like. Victoria's team sent their initial response 20 minutes ago. I've read it. It's—" He paused. "Succinct. What does succinct mean in lawyer? It means 2 pages that are mostly just the phrase no, arranged in different grammatical configurations." He almost sounded like he was enjoying it. "The real estate research document has been contextualized by the firm that produced it. Standard practice documentation. 3 comparable analyses from the same firm, same neighborhood, same notation style. Your garage appears on all 3 because it's a commercial property that appears on every context report for that area." A pause. "There is no case here. There's just noise." "How long does the noise last?" "Depends on how much she wants to spend on it." Dave's voice went back to practical. "My read is she had a theory that sounded good when she first put it together, and now she's seeing it fall apart in real time, and she has 2 choices. She can keep spending money on a case that isn't going to close, or she can take the settlement offer." "What settlement offer?" "The one Victoria's lawyers sent over this morning simultaneously with the response letter." Dave paused. "I should have led with that. Ms. Ashford's team offered Nicole a figure to drop the claim and sign a non-disparagement agreement." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "Victoria's paying her off?" "It's not a large number, more symbolic than financial. It's what her lawyers call a nuisance settlement. It's cheaper than continued litigation for both parties, and it closes the door cleanly." A pause. "Ms. Ashford asked me to tell you she ran it by them independently because she didn't want to make a unilateral decision on something that affected you, but that she'll withdraw the offer immediately if you prefer to litigate." He stood in the garage with the demand letter in one hand and the phone in the other and thought about Nicole on his doorstep with her careful posture and her chosen words. He thought about Darren getting a call from a number he didn't know. He thought about 3 text messages sent at 11 p.m. He thought about how much energy it took to maintain that kind of sustained campaign and what that energy cost and what it was for. "Tell her to keep the offer on the table," he said, "but I want to know when Nicole responds." "You'll be the second call," Dave said. He put the phone in his pocket and looked at the Mustang. The first serious collector inquiry had come in Sunday. One of his contacts had made a call, and the collector was driving down from Charlotte on Thursday to see the car in person. The number being discussed was real. It was the kind of number that didn't happen often in this work, and it had been earned through 9 months of care and skill and attention, and the idea of Nicole's 3 pages of legal noise casting any shadow over it made something in his chest tighten with an anger that was quieter and colder than the hot kind. He was still feeling it when Lily got home from school that afternoon and dropped her backpack in the kitchen doorway and announced that she needed help with a history project, and also that she'd seen a red-tailed hawk from the bus window, and it had been magnificent. "Did you actually see it, or did you think you saw it?" he said, pulling the backpack out of the doorway because someone was going to trip on it. "I actually saw it. It was on a fence post on Route 17. It was huge." She climbed onto a kitchen chair. "Mrs. Patterson says the history project is about local history, and I want to do mine on how Savannah was built and how the infrastructure works, like the squares and the drainage systems." The drainage systems? Victoria explained how they work one time. It's interesting. She looked at him with the certainty of 9 years old. Can Victoria help me? She knows more about it than anybody. He looked at his daughter. You can ask her, he said. Lily was off the chair and out the back door before he'd finished the sentence. He watched through the kitchen window as she knocked on Victoria's back door, and Victoria came out and crouched down to Lily's level in the way she did. Not performing interest in a child, just actually listening. And Lily's arms went wide, explaining the scope of the project. Victoria nodded and pointed at something, and Lily nodded vigorously, and then they both came across the yard together toward the house. Ethan opened the back door. She's going to help me research, Lily announced. I heard. Victoria looked at him over Lily's head with an expression that was slightly apologetic and slightly asking. He stepped back from the door to let them both in. They spent 2 hours at the kitchen table with Victoria's laptop and 3 library books she'd gone and gotten from next door, and Ethan sat at the far end of the table with his own paperwork and occasionally listened to Victoria explain how water moved through the city's historic drainage system and why the squares were placed the way they were, and how the grade of the streets affected everything from flooding to foot traffic. She explained it the way she explained things, clearly, with patience, without dumbing it down, treating Lily like someone capable of understanding difficult ideas. Lily took notes in her purple notebook with the hawk sticker on the cover. At one point, Lily looked up and said, Victoria, did you design any bridges? A few, Victoria said. Real ones? That people drive on? Real ones. In California and Arizona mostly. Are they still there? As far as I know. Lily considered this. That's really cool, she said with the pure, uncomplicated admiration of a child, and then went back to her notes. Victoria caught Ethan's eye across the table. He looked back at her for a moment. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. After Lily went to bed, he and Victoria sat on the porch with tea. It had gotten too cool in the evenings for the beer and sweet tea era of their friendship, and they'd transitioned to tea somewhere in September without discussing it. The porch had accumulated small evidence of both of them over the months. An extra stool he'd brought out, a coffee mug she'd left and he'd never brought back inside, a plant she'd given him that he'd kept alive through genuine effort and inconsistent watering. The demand letter came today, he said. I know, Dave called me. You talked to Dave? About the settlement offer, yes. I should have come to you directly. She held her tea. I thought about it and She stopped. I wanted to solve it. I knew I could solve it. And I reached for the solving before I thought about whether that was the right move. It's fast, he said. It's what I do when I'm anxious, she said, which was about the most unguarded thing he'd ever heard her say. I move to solutions. It's professionally useful and personally so... She paused. Not always right. The offer's fine, he said. Dave says it closes the door cleanly. If she takes it. Will she? Victoria looked at the yard. I think so. I think she made a calculated bet that didn't pay off and she needs a graceful exit. She paused. I'm not trying to make her disappear. I know she's Lily's mother. She's not much of Lily's mother most of the time, he said, and then wished he hadn't said it quite like that because Lily didn't need her parents talking that way about each other even when she wasn't in earshot. Whatever she is or isn't, Victoria said carefully, she's in Lily's life. And anything I do makes it back to Lily. I know that. She looked at him. I'm not trying to win something here. I just want it finished. He nodded. They sat. The Thursday collector visit went better than he'd expected, which was not something Ethan said often about anything. The man from Charlotte was named Robert Purcell, and he was in his mid-60s and had been collecting American muscle since before Ethan was born, and he walked into the garage and went quiet in a way that told Ethan everything he needed to know. He'd seen collectors who performed their knowledge and collectors who actually had it, and Robert Purcell had the quiet of someone with actual knowledge. He spent 2 hours with the car. He went underneath. He pulled the valve covers. He asked questions that demonstrated he already knew the answers and was checking Ethan's competence rather than seeking information. He sat in the driver's seat for a long time. Then he came out of the garage and shook Ethan's hand and named a number. It was above the optimistic end of the range Ethan had quoted Margaret. "I'll need to think about it," Ethan said, "because you always said you needed to think about it." "Of course," Robert said. "I'll give you a week." After he left, Darren appeared from the second bay where he'd been doing not very much with a timing light. "How'd it go?" Ethan told him the number. Darren set the timing light down. "Huh," he said. "Yeah. That's a... Yeah. Daniel Reeves' daughter is going to be..." "I know." Darren picked up the timing light again. "You're going to call Margaret?" "After I talked to Dave about the settlement timeline, I don't want to sell while there's an open claim." "When does the claim close?" "Dave thinks by end of next week if Nicole takes the settlement. And if she doesn't, then we wait." He put his hands in his pockets. "But she will." He was right. The call from Dave came Friday afternoon. Nicole's lawyer had accepted the settlement, the non-disparagement agreement had been signed and returned, and the claim against the Mustang sale was formally withdrawn. Dave said it in the flat professional tone of someone reading off a checklist, and then said, "It's done, Ethan. She's out." He thanked Dave and stood in the garage for a minute. Just a minute. Then he called Margaret Reeves. She answered on the second ring. "I have an offer for you," he said, and told her the number. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that he checked the connection. "Margaret." "I'm here," she said. Her voice was compressed in the way voices got when they were working against something. "That's..." She stopped. "Ethan, that's real?" "It's real. Collector out of Charlotte. He'll take care of it. Daddy would have..." She stopped again. He waited. "He would have laughed," she said finally. "He bought that car for $4,200. He would have laughed until he cried." "It's a good car," Ethan said. "You made it a good car," she said. "Don't sell yourself short." He was quiet for a moment. "You want to take the offer?" "Yes," she said. "Yes, absolutely yes." He handled the paperwork Friday afternoon and confirmed the sale to Robert Purcell, and by 5 o'clock it was done. The Mustang had a buyer and a date and a number that would change Margaret Reeves's year, maybe several years, and the 9-month project that had started under a tarp was finished in every sense. He closed the garage and went inside and found Lily at the kitchen table with homework she was doing at approximately 30% of her actual capability, which was her standard approach to math worksheets. "The Mustang sold," he said. She looked up. "For a lot?" "For a lot." She considered this. "Is that good?" "That's very good." He sat across from her. "It means the work was worth it." She looked at him with the particular directness she'd had since she was about 3. "You already knew the work was worth it." He looked at his daughter. "The money is just the part other people can see," she said, in the tone of someone delivering what she considered obvious information, and went back to her math worksheet. He sat there for a moment. "Lily," he said, "where did you get that?" She shrugged. "Victoria said something like it once, when I asked her why she worked on bridges if she already had enough money." He was quiet. "She said the work was real whether or not anyone paid you for it. She said the bridge holds up or it doesn't, and a number on a check doesn't change whether it holds up." Lily erased something aggressively. "I thought that was true about your cars, too." He looked at his 9-year-old, who had apparently been absorbing lessons in engineering philosophy from the woman next door and filing them away for relevant deployment. "Yeah," he said, "it's true." He helped her with the math worksheet, which she didn't actually need help with, but which gave both of them something to do together for an hour in the kitchen. At dinner, she talked about the history project and the drainage systems and the way the city sat in relation to the river. And he listened and answered and felt the specific quiet satisfaction of a day that had ended better than it started. After she was in bed, he went to the back door and looked out at the yard and then went out through the gate. Victoria's kitchen light was on. He knocked. She opened the door and read his face the way she always did. "It's done," he said. "Both things." She understood without having to ask. "The sale and the settlement." "Both." She exhaled slowly. "Margaret?" "Called her this afternoon." "How was she?" "She said her father would have laughed until he cried." Victoria smiled, and it was the real one, not the careful social version she deployed in professional settings, but the one that reached everything and that he'd seen on maybe a dozen occasions, the kind that happened when she wasn't managing anything and something just got through. He sounds like he was a good man. He sounds like someone who knew what mattered, Ethan said. She looked at him for a moment. Do you want coffee? She said. It's 8 o'clock. I have decaf. He considered this. Yeah, he said. Okay. He came in, and she made the coffee with the same careful focus she brought to the process every time, and they sat at her kitchen table where 6 days ago she'd told him everything from the beginning, and the light from the window had come in at a particular angle, and he'd looked at the coffee ring on the table and thought about how marks lasted whether you meant to leave them or not. What happens now? She said. It was the same question Margaret had asked about the Mustang. He thought about how he'd answered it then. We list it, we find the right buyer, we find someone who will use it the way it was meant to be used. I don't know exactly, he said. Okay, she said, and held her coffee and waited. I know that the settlement is done and Nicole's out, he said. And I know the car is sold and Margaret got what she needed. And I know that... He stopped, looked at the table, looked back at her. I know that I want to stop being careful about the thing I've been being careful about. She went very still. I've been treating this, he gestured between them, like it was a problem to be solved. Like if I could just get the facts straight and the legal situation squared and the feelings identified and labeled correctly, then I'd know what to do. He shook his head slightly. I know how to do that with cars. You get all the information and you make the right decision, but this isn't a car. No, she said quietly. And I keep coming back to the same place, he said. I come back to August in the rain and September on the porch and every conversation we've had in the garage, and it all adds up to the same thing. He met her eyes directly. It adds up to someone I want in my life, in the actual version of my life, not the neighbor version. Victoria's hands tightened around her coffee mug. I'm still working through the rest of it, he said. The not telling, the timeline, all of it. I'm not going to pretend that's just gone. He paused. But the working through is something I want to do towards something, not away from it. She looked at him with the expression he'd first noticed on that September porch, the one that had something very large sitting close behind it. Toward something, she repeated. Yeah. A long pause. The kitchen was very quiet. The coffee was cooling. I've been patient for a long time, she said. Longer than you know, obviously. She said it wryly, acknowledging the absurdity of it, the specifically ridiculous version of patience that had involved a property purchase. And I've been afraid for most of it, that telling you would end it, that not telling you would end it differently. She looked at her hands. I'm tired of being afraid of it. So am I, he said. She looked up. He was still looking at her. He was aware they'd been circling this particular moment for about 6 days and several months simultaneously, which was a strange quality for a moment to have, but here it was regardless. I'm not going to rush it, he said, but I'm not going to avoid it either. Her expression was the real one again, the one that was not composed or managed, that just was. I can work with that, she said. Good. He finished his coffee. It was very good coffee, which he was done pretending to not notice. He said goodnight and walked back through the gate between their properties, which was standing open the way it had been since sometime in June, neither of them having made a decision about it, the decision apparently having made itself. He went inside and stood in the kitchen for a moment. He thought about Daniel Reeves, who had bought a car on impulse at 22 and spent 50 years carrying it as the most impulsive thing he'd ever done and being proud of it. He thought about the grabber orange coming up under the respray, underneath all the years of someone deciding the car should be something other than what it was. He thought about tarps and what they covered, and the difference between something waiting to be found and something gone. He turned off the kitchen light. Outside, through the window over the sink, the gate between the two properties stood open in the dark. The week after the Mustang sale had a different quality to it, quieter. Not empty quiet, but the kind of quiet that came after sustained noise finally stopped. The specific silence of a thing resolved, where you could finally hear the smaller sounds that had been there all along underneath everything else. Ethan took 2 days off. Not vacation exactly, because he didn't really do vacation, But he told Darren there was nothing urgent and let the garage sit. He picked Lily up from school both days and took her to the nature preserve outside of town, where the hawk population was apparently something she needed to verify in person. And they walked the trails for 3 hours with her binoculars and her notebook, and he carried the water bottles and mostly just kept up with her commentary. She saw 2 red-tailed hawks, one Cooper's hawk she wasn't entirely sure about, and what she believed was a loggerhead shrike, which was apparently significant enough to produce a written record on the spot. He watched his daughter crouch in the grass with her binoculars and her absolute concentration on the thing in front of her and thought, she's going to be fine. Whatever he'd managed and whatever he'd failed at, whatever the divorce had cost her in ways that wouldn't fully show up for years, she was going to be fine. She was already someone. He didn't know when that had stopped being something he worried about and started being something he simply knew. But it had. On the 3rd day, he went back to the garage and started on a new intake. A '65 Corvette that a client had been waiting patiently on for 2 months, and whose patience Ethan had been grateful for without adequately expressing. He called the client that morning and gave him a realistic timeline, and the man said, "Take what you need. I know you do right by them." And Ethan thought about what it meant to have a reputation built on something true. He was doing the initial teardown on the Corvette Thursday morning when Victoria came through the gate with coffee. Not unusual. She'd been coming through the gate with coffee for 5 months. What was unusual was that she stopped in the garage doorway and said, "Can I show you something?" He straightened up, wiped his hands. "Yeah." She came in and set the coffee on the workbench and pulled out her sketchbook. The 4th one since she'd moved in, he'd watched her fill 3, and opened it to a page near the middle. She held it out to him. It was the garage. His garage, drawn from outside the open bay door, the perspective of someone standing in the driveway looking in. The Mustang was in it, in the position it had held for months, and the overhead light caught it the way the overhead light caught everything in here. And at the far side of the frame, barely, was a figure bent over the engine, him, recognizable by posture more than any specific feature. The drawing had the quality of something observed over time rather than in a single sitting, accumulated attention rendered in pencil lines. He looked at it for a long moment. "When did you draw this?" he said. "July, I think, maybe early August." She was watching him with the careful attention of someone who wasn't sure how something was going to land. "I've drawn the garage a lot. You've seen some of them. This one I kept putting in the middle of the book so it wouldn't be the first thing visible." "Why are you showing me now?" She took the sketchbook back, looked at the drawing herself. "Because I've been carrying things around in the middle of the book for long enough," she said, "and I thought it was time to stop doing that." He understood what she meant, and she knew he understood. They'd been in that particular conversational register for weeks now, where the surface words and the actual words were the same, but carried additional weight, like a load-bearing structure doing more work than it showed. "I told you I wanted to stop being careful about it," he said. "You did. I meant it." "I know." She closed the sketchbook. I'm not pushing. I just wanted you to see it." She paused. "I've been drawing you for months without saying so, and that felt like another thing being carried in the middle of the book. I wanted it out in the open." He looked at her across the workbench. She was standing with her arms at her sides in the way she stood when she wasn't managing anything, when she'd stopped deciding how to present herself and was just there. He'd learned the difference months ago. "Come look at the Corvette," he said. She blinked slightly, not what she'd expected. "Okay." He pulled the tarp back from the '65 and she came around to stand beside him, and they looked at the car in its current state, partly disassembled, chrome removed, the work visible in its early stages. "What's wrong with it?" she asked. "What's always wrong with them?" he said. "Years of deferred maintenance. Previous owner who fixed the visible stuff without touching what was underneath. The engine's actually solid, which is lucky, but the fuel system needs to be rebuilt from scratch, and the electrical is a mess." He looked at the car. "She'll be something when she's done." "What color?" "Keeping the original, Nassau blue." Victoria looked at the car's current state, the bare metal showing through where panels had been removed, the wiring partially exposed, the work in progress making it look more broken than it had before he'd started. "It gets worse before it gets better," she said. "Always does," he agreed. You can't fix what you can't see. She was quiet for a moment. They both knew they were talking about the car, and not only about the car, and neither of them made a thing of it. I owe you something, he said. She looked at him. Not an apology, he said. I don't think I owe you an apology for being angry or for needing time, but I owe you. He stopped, trying to get the words right. I spent a lot of the last 2 weeks focused on what you withheld, and that was real, and it mattered, and I'm not dismissing it. But I didn't say the other thing. What other thing? That you showed up, he said. Every version of you that you were willing to show me. You actually showed up as that. You didn't perform kindness and then be unkind when I wasn't watching. You didn't pretend to care about the work and then not care. You didn't. He paused. You didn't treat Lily like a way to get to me. You treated her like a person. He looked at the Corvette. The thing you kept from me was about the beginning. Everything after the beginning was real. And I said it, but I don't think I said it like I meant it. Victoria was looking at him very carefully. You meant it, she said quietly. I mean it more now, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. Something in her face moved through several things in quick succession and then settled somewhere that wasn't performed and wasn't managed and was just genuinely, uncomplicatedly there. Okay, she said. The word was soft. Okay, he agreed. They stood next to the half-disassembled Corvette in the October light, and he thought about how the story of how people came together was almost never what you expected it to be. Not clean, not the way it looked from the outside or the way it would sound if you tried to explain it. It was always, underneath the explanations, just two people making a series of choices toward each other until the choices added up to something that held weight. I want to take you somewhere Saturday, he said. She looked slightly surprised. Where? Pooler, he said. She was very still for a moment. The parts store, he said. I want to go get a carburetor for the Corvette's fuel system rebuild, and I want you to come with me. He watched it move through her. What he was saying underneath what he was saying. He was saying, let's start from the place where this actually started. Let's go back to the beginning with both of us knowing where we are. He was saying, I'm not pretending the beginning didn't happen. I'm just choosing to walk into it with you this time, instead of finding out you were there after the fact. That's... She stopped. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. That's a very specific place to choose. I thought so. She looked at him with something in her expression that was new. Not the careful version, not the managed version, not even the real behind the careful version he'd gotten used to. Something further in than any of those. Something that was just her, without any of the layers. Saturday, she said. Saturday, he confirmed. He picked up his coffee from the workbench. Bring your sketchbook. She looked at him for another moment, and then she smiled. The full version, the one that didn't perform anything, and she picked up her own coffee and went back through the gate. He turned back to the Corvette. He was still smiling at the engine bay when Darren showed up an hour later, took one look at him, and said nothing at all, which was the most eloquent response available. Saturday morning was clear and cool, the way October sometimes delivered for free, without warning, like a gift the season wasn't obligated to give. Lily was at her friend Cassie's house for the day, which she'd negotiated herself with the detailed logistics of a 9-year-old who understood that adults needed separate occasions and that participation in creating those occasions was its own form of currency. He told her he was going to the parts store in Pooler, and she'd said, with Victoria? And he'd said yes, and she'd said good, with the flat certainty of someone delivering a verdict they'd reached weeks ago, and then gone back to packing her overnight bag. He knocked on Victoria's back door at 9. She answered in the gray t-shirt he'd seen on her first moving day and jeans, and she had the sketchbook under her arm and the car keys in her hand, and she said, ready, before he could say anything, and something about that made him feel, very specifically, that he was in the right place. They took his truck. He drove, and she sat in the passenger seat with the sketchbook in her lap, and they went through Savannah and out the highway toward Pooler with the windows down because the air was actually worth having windows down for. She didn't draw. She just watched the road. Were you nervous the first time you came here, Bercy? He said. When you moved. The first morning with the coffee. She thought about it. Terrified, she said. I stood at my gate for about 4 minutes before I opened it. He thought about Margaret Reeves sitting in her car in his driveway before she got out. 4 minutes seems to be the number, he said. What do you mean? He told her about Margaret and the car. She listened with the full attention she gave everything. She sat in the driver's seat for a while, he said, just held the wheel, looking at the garage wall. What do you think she was doing? He'd thought about this. I think she was being in 2 times at once, the time when her father bought the car and the time now. I think she was figuring out how to carry both of them. Victoria was quiet for a moment. I think that's what the 4 minutes at the gate was, she said, being in 2 times at once. The parts store in Pooler was exactly what it always was. Fluorescent lights, pegboard walls, the particular smell of metal and rubber and something else he'd never identified. The bell on the door that rang when you pushed it. Dennis was behind the counter reading something on his phone, which he put down with the unhurried pace of a man who'd been doing this long enough that urgency no longer applied to him. Ethan, he said. Dennis. Ethan nodded at him. Need some specific carburetor parts for a 65 Corvette fuel system rebuild. Holly or Rochester? Rochester. Original. Dennis sucked air through his teeth, which meant it was going to take some finding. Give me a few minutes. I'll check the back. He disappeared through the door behind the counter. Ethan turned to Victoria, who was standing in the middle of the store looking at the shelves with the same expression she got when she was taking in spatial information, cataloging it, making it real against the version she'd been carrying in her head. It's smaller than I remembered, she said. They always are. I was standing there. She pointed at an aisle to the left. Automotive gaskets and seals. I didn't need anything from that aisle. I was just... She paused. I was listening. He looked at the aisle. Then he looked at the counter where he'd been standing. The distance between the two was about 12 feet. That's not far, he said. No, she agreed. It's not. He thought about how strange the geography of significant moments was. How 12 feet and one unremarkable Tuesday morning had apparently started something that was now standing here on a Saturday in October. How the specific angle of 2 people's attention in a fluorescent-lit parts store in Pooler, Georgia, had made everything that followed possible. He walked over to the aisle where she'd been standing. He stood in it and looked back toward the counter. This is where you were, he said. Yes. He stood there for a moment. He thought about what she'd seen. The version of him he'd been that day, arguing about a carburetor with the concentration of someone who was only thinking about the carburetor, with no idea anyone was paying attention. He looked at her across the 12 feet of store floor. She was watching him with a completely open expression, not trying to make anything of the moment or steer it, just in it. You know what I was thinking about that day, he said. The Chevelle, she said. The Chevelle, he agreed. Specifically whether a stock rebuild would pass emission testing given the client's planned use case, or whether I should advise an upgrade. He paused. I was thinking about emissions testing. Something in her expression caught like a laugh that almost happened. She stopped. That's what you spent a year thinking about, he said. Me thinking about emissions testing. She made the sound this time. It was a real laugh, surprised out of her, and she put one hand over her mouth like she was trying to hold it back, which didn't work. He looked at her laughing in the aisle of the parts store in Pooler and felt something loosen in his chest that he hadn't known was still tight. It wasn't about the emissions testing, she said, recovering. I know. It was about the way you... I know what it was about, he said. You told me. She smiled, and it was the full version, and it was 12 feet away and not far enough. He crossed the store floor and stood in front of her, close enough that she tilted her head slightly to look at him. And he was very aware of the gap between the moment and what he wanted to do about the moment. And he was also aware that she was aware, and that both of them were in the same place at the same time for possibly the first time in the entire arc of whatever this was. Hi, he said, which was not the most sophisticated thing he'd ever said. Hi, she said back, which didn't need to be sophisticated. Dennis came back through the door behind the counter. Found most of it. Going to need to order one piece, should be here in... He looked up and registered the scene with the total absence of reaction of a man who'd been running a parts store for 30 years and had seen everything. 3 days, he finished and went back to looking at his phone. Ethan looked at Victoria. She was looking back at him with her hands at her sides and the sketchbook under her arm and a smile she wasn't managing anymore. And he thought about the gate between their properties that had drifted open over months without either of them deciding to open it. And he thought about tarp coming off a car that had been waiting a long time to be seen. And he thought about how the most significant things in his life had generally not arrived with music and ceremony, but with the particular quiet of a choice becoming clear. He reached out and took the sketchbook from under her arm. She let him. He set it on the shelf next to a row of gasket sets. Then he put his hand against her jaw, just his palm and her face. And she leaned into it slightly the way she leaned into things she'd been waiting for. And he kissed her in the middle of the parts store in Pooler, Georgia, under fluorescent lights, with Dennis 12 feet away reading his phone. And it was nothing like a movie and entirely like something real. She kissed him back without any ceremony and with complete attention, which was exactly how she did everything. When they pulled apart, she was looking at him with the expression he'd been watching work itself up to for months, the one that was just her, nothing between it and whatever she actually felt. "Emissions testing," she said. He laughed, a real one, from somewhere that hadn't had much call for it in a while. She smiled at the laugh and he thought, there it is, that's the thing. Dennis said without looking up, "Y'all want the part number for that carburetor kit, or not?" Ethan turned back to the counter. "Yeah, Dennis, let's get the part number." He bought what he needed. Victoria carried the bag. They went back out to his truck in the clear October morning, and he held the door, and she said, "You don't have to do that." And he said, "I know." And she got in, and he went around and got in the driver's side, and they sat there for a moment before he started the engine. "That was the place," she said. "That was the place," he confirmed. "It's a very ordinary place." "Most places are," he said, "where things start." She looked at him and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer, and he started the truck, and they drove back to Savannah through the October morning. November arrived and the garage stayed busy. The Corvette's fuel system came together the way these things did when the parts were right, and the attention was sustained. Slowly and then suddenly, the car beginning to breathe the way it was supposed to breathe after decades of not. Ethan had 3 other projects queued behind it, and a 4th inquiry from a collector in Atlanta about a '67 Shelby Mustang that would, if it came through, be the most significant project he'd attempted. He called Margaret Reeves to let her know the sale had formally closed. The car had transferred to Robert Purcell in Charlotte, and the funds were in the account she'd specified. She cried again, briefly, and then said her father would have wanted 10% to go to the high school automotive program in the county where he'd taught for 30 years. Ethan said that was a fine thing to do and meant it. Robert Purcell sent him a photograph 2 weeks after the transfer. The Mustang on a mountain road somewhere outside of Charlotte, grabber orange against fall trees, moving the way it was built to move. He taped it to the wall above the workbench next to the drawing Victoria had made of the Mustang's front quarter panel, which had been there since August without comment. The photographs and drawings accumulated on that wall, not decoratively arranged, just there the way things in working spaces were there, layered, lived in, evidence of the years accumulating. Life adjusted in the way that lives did when something important shifted without making a lot of noise about it. Victoria came through the gate in the mornings with coffee, same as before, except now they sat together in the garage or on the porch, and the sitting together had a different quality to it. Not dramatic, just acknowledged. The space between them had changed its shape, and the new shape was more comfortable than the old one, even though the old one had had its own specific comfort. He kissed her in the driveway one afternoon when she brought him lunch he hadn't asked for, but had apparently looked like he needed, and Darren, inside the garage, said loudly to no one in particular that he was going to take an early break, and then made a great deal of noise leaving through the side door. Victoria pulled back and said, "He saw that." "Darren sees everything," Ethan said. "He's very discreet about it, and then he tells exactly no one except me, so it works out." She laughed. He was accumulating those, her real laughs, the surprised ones, the ones that happened when something got through before she could decide how to respond to it. They were different from her polite smiles in the way that rain was different from a photograph of rain. Lily's adjustment was not an adjustment at all. That was the honest truth of it, and Ethan spent some time thinking about what it meant, His daughter had apparently already decided that Victoria was a fixed point in the landscape of her life sometime around the first week of June when she'd knocked on the back door to ask about the drafting table, and nothing that had happened since had given her reason to revise that assessment. When she came home from school and Victoria was in the kitchen or the garage or the yard, Lily's acknowledgement of her presence was the easy acknowledgement of someone who had expected to find her there. "Do you know what Lily said to me last week?" Victoria told him one evening. They were on the porch, tea going cold, the November dark coming in earlier than it had been. "I'm afraid to ask." She said, "Victoria, do you think you'll live here forever?" She paused. Just like that. Very matter of fact. He looked at her. "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know. I said I hoped so." She held her tea. She said, "Good," and went back inside. That was the whole conversation. He thought about his daughter and her economy of language on matters she considered settled. "That's Lily's version of a formal welcome, Suk," he said. "I gathered that." They sat. The night insects were mostly gone now, the temperature finally doing what November was supposed to do. The oak tree in Victoria's yard had half its leaves left, the rest of them on the ground making a mess neither of them had fully dealt with. "I've been thinking about the Atlanta project," he said. "The Shelby Mustang inquiry. If it comes through, it's going to be a significant commitment, more than anything I've taken on before." He looked at the yard. "I probably need to hire a second full-time person. Maybe look at expanding the second bay." "You should do it," she said. "The expansion would cost money." "I know. I wasn't asking for—" He stopped because he heard how it sounded, and he needed to be accurate. "I wasn't asking you for help with the expansion." "I know that too," she said. She looked at him directly. "I'm just saying you should do it. The Shelby project is the kind of thing you've been building toward. The expansion is the right infrastructure for the work you want to do." She paused. "And I know you have a plan for how to fund it that doesn't involve me, and you should run that plan." He was quiet for a moment. "You're very careful about the money," he said. "Yes." "Why?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about things she'd actually considered. "Because it's the most obvious way I could distort things," she said. "Not intentionally, but money distorts things without trying. It shifts the weight of a thing without anyone deciding to shift it." She looked at her tea. "I want what's between us to have the weight it actually has, not the weight the money adds." She paused. "Does that make sense?" "Yeah," he said. "It does." "If you ever ask me for help, I'll help you," she said. "But I'm not going to offer it in ways that blur the lines. I'd rather have the lines clear." He looked at her profile in the porch light, the particular way she held herself when she was being direct about something that mattered. None of the management, all of the precision. "I told you I wasn't done being angry a few weeks ago," he said. She looked at him. "I think I'm done," he said. She held his gaze. "You're sure?" "I'm sure it's not the main thing anymore," he said. "The not telling. I understand why you did it, and I'm not going to stop understanding that, but I'm also not going to keep picking it up and putting it down." He looked at the yard. "It happened. It was the wrong choice. You know it was the wrong choice, and we're past it." "We're past it," she said quietly. "We're not pretending it didn't happen. We're just—" He searched for the right word. "Done letting it be the biggest thing in the room." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Thank you." "Don't thank me for it. It's just—" He paused. "I've spent a long time holding on to things past their usefulness. The divorce, certain—" He stopped. "I'm not doing that with this. I'd rather put the energy somewhere better." She was looking at him with something very quiet in her expression. Something that had been there before, but that had a different quality now. Steadier, less waiting in it, and more arrived. "That's a good way to live," she said. "It's a new habit," he said honestly. "I'm working on it." She almost smiled. "For what it's worth," she said, "I think you're better at it than you think you are." The Shelby project came through the first week of December. The collector was a 60-year-old woman named Patricia Chen, who'd inherited the car from her brother and had done enough research to understand what she had, and she spoke about it with the same reverence that Margaret had brought to the Mustang. The reverence of someone who understood that a car was a container for something else, and that the something else was what actually mattered. Ethan said yes before they'd finished discussing the terms. Patricia laughed and said she could tell he was the right person for it, and he thought of all the things that had led to him being someone whose yes on a project like this meant something. He told Victoria over coffee the next morning. "The Shelby," she said. "She's a 67. Fastback. Numbers matching." He shook his head slightly. "I haven't worked on one before. In terms of scope, it's different from the Mustang. Similar bloodline, but different animal," she said. "Different animal." He looked at his coffee. "It's going to be a while. Longer than anything I've done." "What color?" "I don't know yet. Patricia doesn't know yet. We're going to find out what's underneath the current paint before we decide." He paused. "It might be something we haven't found yet." She looked at him with something that carried its own meaning. "You'll find it," she said. He thought about the grabber orange coming up through the respray. He thought about the particular satisfaction of uncovering what something actually was beneath the years of other people deciding what it should be. He thought about the gate between the properties that was still open, that no one had thought to close, that now existed as simply the way things were rather than the decision anyone had consciously made. He thought about how that was the most accurate description of the best things, not chosen in a single moment, but arrived at through accumulation, through all the small choices that added up to a shape no one had drawn in advance. Christmas arrived with Lily's particular form of intensity, which was total. She had opinions about the tree, the decorations, the specific type of cocoa, and the movie they watched on Christmas Eve, all of which she expressed with the confidence of someone who'd been running this operation for years, which she had been, largely because Ethan had abdicated most of the aesthetic decisions after year one of doing them alone. Victoria was invited to Christmas dinner because Lily invited her directly in the middle of November without consulting Ethan. He'd found out through Victoria, who'd called him from next door and said, "Your daughter just asked me for Christmas dinner, and I said yes before I thought to check with you, and I realize I should have checked with you." "It's fine," he said. "You're sure?" "Lily doesn't ask for things she doesn't mean," he said. "If she asked you, she wanted you there." The dinner was not a smooth operation. The roast took longer than planned. Lily overseasoned the green beans in a way that everyone ate without complaint. The gravy had a texture situation that was resolved through vigorous whisking and the collective decision not to discuss it. Victoria contributed a dessert she'd made from scratch that she confessed she'd practiced twice, which Lily found deeply reassuring and Ethan found quietly moving, that she had practiced a dessert to bring to his table. After dinner, while Lily was occupied with the aftermath of presents, Victoria helped him with the dishes in the kitchen. They worked in the easy quiet of people who'd been in the same kitchen enough that the movement didn't require coordination. He washed, she dried, the dishwater went cold, and they kept going. "My parents want to meet you," she said. He looked at her sideways. "I called them last week," she said. "They asked how things were. I told them," she paused. "I told them there was someone." He handed her a pot. "What did they say?" "My mother asked what you did, and I said you restored classic cars. And she said, that's a real thing, and she meant it as a compliment." A small pause. "My father asked if you were a good man, and I said yes." He held the dishwater warm water in the sink and looked at the window above it, the dark yard beyond where the gate was standing open between the two properties. "Am I going to be nervous about your parents?" he said. "Probably. They're good people, which is somehow more intimidating." She dried the pot. "My mother's going to ask you about every car you've ever worked on. She has opinions about American muscle that she developed from my father's collection of magazines in the basement, and her opinions are very confident and moderately informed, and she's going to want to discuss them." "I can work with that." "My father's going to be quiet and watch you with Lily, and then tell me later what he thinks." "What do you think he'll think?" She looked at him. "I think he'll think I finally made a sensible decision," she said, "which will make him very happy, because he'd say he's been waiting." He laughed. She smiled at the laugh, the way she smiled at his real ones, like they were worth something to her. He thought about that, about being someone whose laugh was worth something to another person. It had been a while since he'd thought of himself that way, and it turned out that thinking of yourself that way changed how you stood in a room. The new year arrived with the Corvette finished and delivered, and the client calling him a craftsman, which Ethan deflected and then thought about for the rest of the day. The Shelby project began in earnest in January, and the teardown revealed, as teardowns usually did, both better and worse than expected, in the specific combination that kept the work honest and the restorer humble. Under the current dark blue paint was original silver, a lovely clean factory silver that the previous decade had apparently decided was boring, had sprayed over with something darker, and in doing so had hidden the car's particular kind of beauty under a color that was fine but wasn't it. He photographed it and sent the image to Patricia Chen. She called back in 3 minutes. "Is that original?" Paint analysis confirms it. Factory specification silver. "Keep it," she said immediately. "Obviously keep it." He stood in the garage and looked at the silver coming back through the paint stripper and thought about what Victoria had said once, about people deciding they don't want to be what they were. He thought about how the cars that had been covered up were always the most interesting ones to bring back, the ones where the original was worth finding again. He thought this was probably true of more than cars, which was not an original observation, but it was his. On a Friday evening in late January, Victoria came through the gate without coffee for once, just herself, and she had something in her hand. He was closing up the garage and she stood in the doorway and held it out. It was a keychain, small, metal, unremarkable to look at, a simple circular ring with a small enamel tag, dark blue, no particular brand or emblem. The kind of thing you'd pick up at a gift shop in an airport or a parts store. He looked at it. Then he looked at her. "I've had this since Pooler," she said. "The first time. I bought it from the bin by the register when Dennis wasn't looking at me. She stopped. "I needed something that placed me in the moment, something that said, 'This is real, this happened, you were here.'" She paused. "I've had it in my bag since November of last year." He took it from her hand. The enamel was slightly worn on one edge from being carried. The metal had the warmth of something that had been next to a person for a long time. "A year and some," he said. "A year and some," she confirmed. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it on his keys, alongside the house key and the garage key, and the key to the storage unit out back. He held them up so she could see it there among the ordinary things. She looked at it on his keys and said nothing for a moment. "I have something for you too," he said. He went to the workbench and came back with a photograph. One of the ones Robert Purcell had sent, the Mustang on the mountain road, orange against the fall trees moving. He'd had it printed at the copy shop on Abercorn and framed in a simple black frame, the kind you got from a drugstore, nothing elaborate. "You drew the car," he said. "You should have a picture of it where it went." She took the photograph and looked at it for a long time. He watched her look at it, the way she looked at things she was actually seeing, with all her attention gathered in. "He's driving it," she said. "That's the whole point." She looked up from the photograph at him. "That's the whole point," she said back, and she meant something larger than the car, and he knew she meant something larger than the car, and they both let that sit in the air between them in the January evening, in the garage that smelled like metal and old oil, and the particular mix of her coffee and his work that had become the smell of this year. He closed the garage behind them and they went through the gate together. The gate between the two properties had no lock on it. Neither of them had thought to put one on or thought to take it off, and it had been open so long now that calling it open didn't quite cover it. It was just the way the properties were, a fact of the geography. Lily was doing homework at the kitchen table when they came in, and she looked up and assessed the situation with the economy of a person who'd already reached her conclusions weeks ago. "Is it dinner time?" she said. "Probably," Ethan said. "Victoria, are you staying?" "If that's all right," Victoria said. "Obviously," Lily said, in the tone of someone clarifying a settled matter, and went back to her homework. Ethan looked at Victoria across the kitchen. She was holding the photograph of the Mustang and her keychain was in her coat pocket, and she was standing in his kitchen with the naturalness of someone who had been standing in this kitchen long enough that it had become, in some specific and unannounced way, partially hers. He thought about what he'd told Margaret Reeves when she'd asked how the Mustang would be handled. "We find the right buyer, someone who will use it the way it was meant to be used." He thought about the way the right fit was never the most obvious thing or the most expected thing. It was the thing that held up under use, the thing that stayed. He'd spent years restoring machines that people had covered up, given up on, Let sit under tarps in garages where they might have stayed forever, unseen. He'd spent his working life in the business of finding out what something actually was and returning it to that, not making it something new, just clearing away everything that wasn't it. He'd spent the years since his marriage ended doing a quiet version of the same thing to himself. Clearing away, getting back to what was solid. He hadn't expected the process to include a woman who'd seen something in him from 12 feet away in a parts store and spent a year in some carrying a keychain that said, "This was real. This happened. You were here." He hadn't expected a lot of things about this year. That was probably the point. "I'll start dinner," he said. "I'll help," Victoria said. "I'll supervise," Lily said without looking up. Ethan opened the refrigerator and looked at the available materials, which were adequate, and thought about what could be made from adequate materials with enough attention and willingness to see what was actually there. He thought the answer to that was more than you'd expect. He thought most of the best things were. Outside, through the kitchen window over the sink, the gate between the two properties stood open in the winter evening dark, the way it had been standing open for months, the way it would go on standing open, no one needing to decide. Some things didn't need deciding. Some things just stayed.